Hello, good morning. You join us live at Westminster, where the Conservatives have won their biggest majority since 1987. Boris Johnson's gamble to hold a December election has paid off with a majority of 78. The Prime Minister says it gives him a mandate to get Brexit done.
Well, we did it! We did it! We pulled it off, didn't we? We pulled it off. We broke the deadlock, we ended the gridlock, we smashed the roadblock.
The Prime Minister is now inside number 10, having pledged to earn the support of people who, in his words, may have lent him their vote. An awful night for Labour, losing 59 seats, many of them in places the party has held for decades. Jeremy Corbyn said the results were very disappointing.
I want to also make it clear that I will not lead the party in any future general election campaign. I will discuss with our party to ensure there is a process now of reflection.
Boris Johnson pledges to work day and night to retain the support of those Labour voters who deserted Jeremy Corbyn as Labour suffered its worst defeat since the dark days of Michael Foot.
Liberal Democrat leader Jo Swinson has quit after she loses her own seat to the SNP and the party fails to improve its position at Westminster.
For millions of people in our country, these results will bring dread and dismay, and people are looking for hope.
A strong result for the SNP, who now hold 48 seats out of the 59 in Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon says it sends a clear message for a second independence referendum there.
That independence referendum that was very much at the heart of the SNP's campaign, there is a renewed, refreshed, strengthened mandate for that.
So, the deadlock broken, Emily. We will delve deep into these numbers through the course of the day. We will pick out the patterns and we will show you some record swings across the country. And we will show you the changing picture in Scotland and Northern Ireland too.
Our hexagon map, where we have made every single constituency the same size, shows exactly where the balance of power now lies. Labour's wall has been shrunk dramatically. Scotland has gone SNP yellow.
Well, the result of the election means big change in the House of Commons and for the country. The UK will now leave the European Union by the end of next month. We'll be speaking to the main parties and we'll bring you all the events and the reaction from here throughout the day. Hello, good morning and welcome to viewers here in the UK on BBC One and the BBC News Channel and around the globe on BBC World News. Here at Westminster, the Conservatives have taken control of the House of Commons after an overwhelming win in the general election. The Tories have a majority of 78 with just one seat still to declare. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, said no one could refute his stonking mandate to deliver Brexit, and he now plans to push ahead to get the UK to leave the European Union at the end of January. Jeremy Corbyn said Labour's result was a disappointing night and that he would not fight a future general election. The Liberal Democrats had a terrible night as the party leader Jo Swinson lost her seat and quit. But the SNP did well, coming close to sweeping the board in Scotland. Let's take a look at the result as they stand 9 o'clock this morning. So the Conservatives there winning 364 seats. That's a gain of 47. Labour took 203. They're down 59. The SNP have 48 MPs, an increase of 13 overnight. The Liberal Democrats only have 11, down 1, including, of course, their leader. The DUP 8 and Sinn Féin, who don't take their seats, 7. This is the vote share in Great Britain. We can show you what that looks like now. The Conservatives have gained 45% share of the vote. Labour is on 33%. The Liberal Democrats, 12%. The SNP are on 4%, just in Scotland. The Greens, 3%. And the Brexit Party on 2%. We'll bring you all the reaction. We'll speak to all the main parties and look at what the result means for Westminster, for Brexit. But stay with us throughout the day. Right now, we're going to go to Norman Smith, our assistant political editor. It's a long day ahead of us, Norman. What are you expecting to happen there next?
Well, I expect Boris Johnson will be having his breakfast after what has been, frankly, an extraordinary night for him. I don't think even he could have believed he would achieve this scale of victory, which to me seems on a par with what Margaret Thatcher achieved in 1979 or Tony Blair in 1997. It's one of those benchmark, landmark election victories which represents a moment of change in the history of this country. And like Margaret Thatcher and like Tony Blair, Boris Johnson has succeeded in reaching out well beyond his core constituency to attract voters who would normally never support his party. And when we talk about breaching the so-called red wall, it's worth remembering many of these constituencies, it's not just the fact they've always been Labour, but these are constituencies which frankly were devastated by the consequences of deindustrialisation, the closure of steel plants, the closure of pits. And for many of these communities, voting Tory was anathema, something they would never, ever consider. And yet we have found many of these constituencies, people not just abstaining, choosing that they're not going to back Labour, not just going to other parties, be it the Brexit Party or the Liberal Democrats, but leaping straight over from Labour to the Tories. And that is an amazing achievement. What does it mean? It means, it seems to me, Boris Johnson has just won a two-term majority, because with the scale of majority he's got, it's very hard to see how in one bound Labour or another party can somehow claw back all those seats. So Boris Johnson could well be in number 10 for the next 10 years. It also means, I think, we will find out who actually Boris Johnson is, because he's been a very malleable politician who says one thing to one group of people, another to another group of people. Now he has a free hand. He can do what he believes in. And many of his supporters, people who were with him during his days as London Mayor, believe the true one nation Boris Johnson, the metropolitan liberal conservative, will re-emerge now he's got a free hand. And others also believe he will have much greater freedom when it comes to negotiating that final Brexit deal. No longer will he have his arm up behind his back because of the Brexiteers. So at long last, we will find out who Boris Johnson truly is.
Interesting question, Norman. Thanks very much indeed. We'll have much more analysis of those results in a moment. But first, Jonathan Blake has the story of the night and a warning: there are flashing images in this report.
In the dark before dawn, Boris Johnson punches the air in victory, arriving at Conservative Party headquarters to congratulate staff on a convincing win. He told supporters they had caused a political earthquake.
Well, we did it. We did it. We pulled it off, didn't we? We pulled it off. We broke the deadlock. We ended the gridlock. We smashed the roadblock.
And after turning once solid Labour seats Tory blue, he promised not to let voters down.
Your hand may have quivered over the ballot paper as before you put your cross in the Conservative box. And you may intend to return to Labour next time round. And if that is the case, I am humbled that you have put your trust in me and that you have put your trust in us. And I and we will never take your support for granted.
Going to resign, Mr Corbyn?
There's no hiding from the scale of Labour's defeat. Jeremy Corbyn says he won't fight another election as leader, but was he to blame for such a devastating loss?
I don't think so. I think on the policy issues we won the argument, but we literally couldn't break through Brexit. We tried our best to have a policy of principle where we bring the country back together again, both Remain and Leavers, but that obviously proved to be impossible.
You lost your seat, Miss Swinson.
Disaster for the Liberal Democrats. Their leader had lost her seat, her party and its supporters in despair.
For millions of people in our country, these results will bring dread and dismay, and people are looking for hope.
But celebration for the Scottish National Party, winning seats, helping the leader make her case.
I don't pretend that every single person that voted SNP yesterday will necessarily support independence, but there has been a strong endorsement in this election of Scotland having a choice over our future.
Re-elected, Boris Johnson has returned to Downing Street. His election gamble has given him a new mandate to govern. Jonathan Blake, BBC News.
Well, now we're going to sweep across our newsroom, which, as you can see, is a hive of activity. Still over to our election results centre, where Christian Fraser is waiting for us. I've stood in front of that screen, Christian. I thought I'd seen it all over the last few elections, but clearly not. Quite an extraordinary night that you've had there.
You ain't seen nothing like this, Emily. No, quite extraordinary. We've got most of the results in. We're just waiting for this one down here, St Ives, down in Cornwall. That's a Conservative Lib Dem marginal. Still waiting for the boxes from the Scilly Isles. Bad weather down there. But really, the results are in. And as Emily has told you, this is the best result for the Conservatives since 1987. Conversely, for Labour, that's their worst post-war result in terms of seats, worse than Michael Foot in 1983. And it gets better for the Conservatives in terms of vote share, best since 1979. Although you can see it's only actually plus 1.2% on what Theresa May got in 1987. What has happened is that the working class vote for Labour has collapsed in those post-industrial areas around the country. So the Conservative vote share up 11% in working class areas, only up around 7% in middle class voting areas. We've also said it's the Brexit election, and that tells you in very stark terms that it was. Look at those areas, strong Leave seats that voted over 60% Leave in 2016. The Conservative seats up 28, Labour down 28. But look in the strong Remain seats, those areas that voted for Remain by over 60%, not so good for the Conservatives or Labour. So what you see on the map is the march of blue into North East Wales, into the West Midlands, into the North East, the red wall completely obliterated on the night. And let's just look at some of those seats that we're talking about. This was the biggest swing of the night. Bassetlaw in Nottinghamshire, former mining town, John Mann standing down. Just look at the swing. 18%, quite extraordinary. Or another one. Let's go to Dudley North, the seat of Ian Austin. Remember, urging Labour voters to vote Conservative. So angry about the anti-Semitism within Labour. Again, a massive swing, 16% towards the Conservatives. And this one, quite extraordinary. In 2005, Sedgefield, the seat of Tony Blair, they had a majority of 18,000 at the nadir of Blairism. After 9 years of Labour opposition, Paul Howell for the Conservatives has taken it with a majority of 4,500. So an extraordinary picture that we're going to be looking at across the country for the Conservatives. And also, of course, we're going to look at Scotland because the picture very different in Scotland. A very good night for the SNP, and that is going to bring up those questions about the union, Emily.
Really interesting, Christian. Yeah, we'll get on to that. With me now is the Tory Minister, Helen Whately. And just looking at that swathe of blue, Helen, what that tells us straight away is that you are going to be governing in areas where there is heavy dependence, there has been heavy dependence on public services. You are now, I guess, the party of the working class. And when you look at Workington, at the swathe of red that is now your mandate, you've got to deliver something really important for those people.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the fact is, in this election, thousands, if not millions of people are putting their trust in us, people who've never voted Conservative before. So it's really, really important we deliver for them, both on Brexit and getting Brexit done, but also, as you say, on public services, on the NHS, on education.
So what changes? Because that manifesto was about that thin, right? There was very little that told us anything other than a slogan about Brexit, which probably can't be kept to, in all honesty. We don't know about social care. We look at the NHS funding and see it's not nearly as much as was put in over the Labour years. We haven't got much detail on education. Is any of that going to come to the top of the pile now?
Well, I think actually the manifesto, and also we've talked about during the campaign, has been quite clear, for instance, on our commitment on the NHS, record levels of funding going into that, but
record
also...
for you, not record for a government, you know that.
Well, but a huge increase in funding for the NHS, 50,000 more nurses going to be in the NHS, more
so
doctors.
So you're still using the
training.
50,000, are you?
Well, yes, because that's the difference between the number that there would be versus there wouldn't be with the plans that we have to... But, I mean, honestly, and this whole result shows that we are the people at the party who've listened to people. We have listened to people across the country, and we're going to make sure their votes count.
You're also the party that has been in power for the last 10 years, with the worst NHS waiting times that we've seen in years. At what point do you have to recognise all the things that the Conservatives weren't doing right, that the damage they have done, that austerity has done, and say, actually, we have to take responsibility for that as we change what happens next?
Well, I think, and I found talking to people during this campaign, people actually understood the mess that Labour left us in financially all the way back in 2010.
Really? So you're going back to 2010, not the last decade?
But I think people did understand the financial position that we were in. They also appreciate that actually the NHS is coping with a huge increase in demand and that we are committed to making sure it can deliver on that.
So that's a really important point. So if you think that Labour left you in a terrible place in 2010, that was after we saw record investment in the NHS, you have to choose, don't you? Either we are going to see record investment in the NHS and a real approach to social care and a real attempt to get waiting times down, or else we're going to carry on blaming Labour under Blair and Brown for that kind of investment in the NHS, which you say caused the damage. So which is it?
Well, I think absolutely. Now we've got our economy back on track. Now we've got the deficit down. Now we're in a much stronger position economically to invest in public services, to put more into the NHS, as we absolutely want to do.
We don't know that we've got the economy back on track because we do have Brexit coming down the track at us, and we know from recent figures that the economy is not growing as fast as it has been. So I don't know what you mean by back on track.
We know that the uncertainty of the Brexit process has been difficult for the economy. It's been really difficult for businesses, and businesses, like most voters, want us to move on, get Brexit done. That will then give greater stability. I mean, you saw the pound go flying up when it looked like when the exit poll came out, and it looked like we would get a majority. So actually we're going to get a boost for the economy.
Helen, because you don't come at Brexit from the Brexiteer stance. You are a Remainer, you are a one-nation Conservative. What is the vision that you want your party to have for Brexit now?
Well, one thing I'd say is I think we have to stop talking about Brexiteers and Remainers. We're one country which is going to get on and get Brexit done.
But we still don't know what Brexit looks like. I mean, that was very carefully shielded during the campaign. We don't know what Brexit looks like. We don't know whether it's alignment, whether we're going to be in competition with Europe, next to Europe, very closely related to Europe. What is your vision for that? Is it what the Trump tweet promised a couple of hours ago, the biggest trade deal that would make us forget all about Europe?
I'm not going to commit to whatever Trump has tweeted, but no, first of all, we know we have to get the withdrawal deal through, and we're going to move very, very quickly, immediately, to making progress before Christmas on the withdrawal agreement, so we can leave on the 31st of January, and then we can move on, yes, to our future relationship with Europe, but also healthcare, schools, policing, all the things that we heard from people in this election really matter to people day to day.
John, it's such an interesting moment, this, because the Conservatives, I think Boris Johnson even used that term, a sort of new dawn. You know, he will see this as a new start and a new approach, and yet we have had a decade of Conservative rule. And as Norman was saying there, we don't know which Boris Johnson we're going to get now.
No, we don't. I mean, he has to now define himself in a way that he hasn't been able to or had the opportunity to do so until now. The voters of this country have, yes, given him a triumphant election win, and he now has the blue flag flying in areas where we haven't seen it since Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister. But how do you keep those blue-collar Conservatives, in many cases rather reluctant blue-collar Conservatives, happy in these coming months and weeks and years? Now, look, one nation conservatism sounds good when you say it. It looks good on a poster and in a speech, but what does it mean? You can put money into the NHS, but the money that's being discussed has a lot to do with just trying to keep pace with demands on the NHS. It's not transforming the service in these coming months and years. When it comes to the money going into schools, it's about keeping pace with rising school rolls. And when it comes to police, all of these thousands of police are the numbers that have been cut by the Conservative government over past years. So making these people, these new blue-collar Conservatives, feel they've got something new for their vote, lending Boris Johnson their trust, that won't be easy. And we haven't even got into Brexit.
Thank you both very much indeed. We're going to head to Scotland in a moment, talk to the Health Minister there after an extraordinary night for the SNP. Let us just show you, though, how the results played out overnight in Scotland. You can see the share of the vote there, first of all. The SNP on astonishing 45%, gains of 8%. The Conservatives on 25%. They've held up their share of the vote there pretty much, down 3%. Labour took the big losses overnight. They're on 19%, down 9%. The Lib Dems made gains in terms of that share. We know that they have more of a problem with the first past the post system. Indeed, that was the system that yielded the loss of their leader's own seat there. The Greens have stayed the same, and very little movement from the Brexit party. Let's talk then to Jean Freeman, the Health Minister for the SNP, who's in Glasgow. And what does this mean, Jean, for your plans now for independence?
So good morning.
Morning.
Well, it has been, as you've said, a very good night for the SNP, but actually what it's been is a very good night for the people of Scotland, who've made it really clear for the 17th general election in a row that they reject the Conservatives. They reject the idea of leaving the European Union. They reject Brexit. They did by 62% in the European election not that long ago. And so what we will now do, because we pay attention to what people in Scotland say and what they vote, we will now, as our First Minister said, make that request for the Section 30 order, which would legally permit a referendum on independence in Scotland, so that people in Scotland have the right to choose what their future should be. That doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who voted for the SNP yesterday were supporters of independence, but what they were supporters of was the right for Scotland to choose its own future.
I'm sure there was a certain sense of triumph amongst your party and MPs last night. There was an extraordinary reaction from Nicola Sturgeon at the news that Jo Swinson, the Lib Dem leader, had lost her seat in East Dunbartonshire. I'm sure that Nicola Sturgeon will see that as a gain, a moment of triumph, but I wonder if that seems a particularly seemly reaction from your party leader when you reflect on that this morning, Jean.
So we were pleased with many of the wins that we made last night. Sorry to lose a very good MP in Stephen Gethens, who lost in North East Fife. But our focus, as it has always been, is on winning the arguments and securing the votes and then getting on with the job. And already this morning, that's where our focus is now. What do we have to do now to respond to the trust that the voters in Scotland have continued to place in us, ask for that Section 30 order, which Boris Johnson, quite frankly, you cannot talk about being a one-nation Conservative when one of the nations of the United Kingdom has so comprehensively said we reject the Conservatives and we reject leaving the European Union and we want the choice of our own future. The Conservatives need to respond to that.
How comprehensively are you saying that, Jean? If you are not allowed an independence referendum, will you go your own way, have one anyway?
We need to have we've said this very clearly, we need to have a referendum that is legally sound and therefore recognised not only as democratically and legally valid by people in Scotland, but also in an international context. And really, the question is not to us about what our plan B might be. Our plan A was to comprehensively win in this general election. We've done that, and to ask on the basis of that for that Section 30 order. So our plan A worked. The question is now to Boris Johnson, on what possible democratic grounds do you believe you can stand as a one-nation Conservative, as you now want to ascribe yourself to that? What possible ground do you have to say that the people of Scotland do not have that democratic right?
Jean Freeman, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Sophie Rayworth has spent the night surveying a vast map of the entire United Kingdom, showing the changing political landscape in hexagons. And I think I'm right in saying that there should be just one gap on your map now, Sophie, is that right?
Just one, St Ives. We're still waiting for that. But now you can see with each constituency reduced to exactly the same size, one hexagon, you can see where that power now lies. Not huge changes in the south of England. This is all London here, dominated still by Labour, but the huge changes are up here. North East Wales, the Midlands, the north of England, and Scotland, of course, which has almost turned completely yellow. Something I couldn't do last night is walk from one coast to the other along a blue path of Conservative seats. And that's because the Conservatives have really made such big inroads into what were Labour strongholds, Labour heartlands, like Wakefield, for example, which have been held by Labour since 1932. Mary Creagh's seat now in Conservative hands. Well, I'm joined by Anna Menon, who is a Professor of European Politics for King's College London. You are also from Wakefield yourself, aren't you? You understand more than anybody the seismic change there.
I think regardless of your political affiliation, if you come from that part of the world, saying things like Wakefield is Conservative or Don Valley has gone Conservative, it's just a real sort of seismic shock, and it speaks to the fact that the sort of political map of the UK is being redrawn and the bases of support for each of the two big parties are being redefined, and that's really a profound moment, I think.
And so many of these seats that have gone blue, Wrexham in North East Wales, for example, these are all Leave voting seats. It's the Brexit vote.
Yeah, it is, but I mean, we've got to trace it back a bit further, because certainly in Yorkshire, what you see from the end of the Blair-Brown period is increasing disengagement. Then a lot of these people started to vote UKIP, and then you get the Brexit referendum, which pushes some of them to sort of try voting Tory. So quite a lot of them did in 2017, not enough for Theresa May to win these seats, but she laid the groundwork for what happened last night, which is to push the Tories over that 50% or over the majority they needed in those seats to finally turn these areas blue when they've been red for so long.
It is really quite stark, though, isn't it, how the red wall has been breached, well, not quite breached, but certainly huge cracks in it. It's shrunk dramatically. This result will mean that Brexit probably, almost certainly, will happen and happen fast.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that with this Prime Minister, I think even if he'd secured a majority of just one, we would have left the European Union at the end of January. Now there's absolutely no doubt about it. By the start of February, we will no longer be a member state of the European Union.
OK, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to travel down England a little bit here as well and join some of our voters who have come to talk to us. A Labour voter from Stoke, which has gone blue.
Yeah, we're absolutely devastated. My friends and family were absolutely devastated. Labour really did push to engage all of the young voters.
What went wrong?
Well, I haven't really met any Conservative voters. Maybe that's just because I stayed in my sphere, but I'm absolutely devastated.
A Lib Dem voter here.
That's right.
Not a good night for Liberal Democrats. Liberal Democrats lost their leader, Joe Swinson.
Yes, she clearly didn't connect, it seems, with the population. And I think people had had enough of waiting for Brexit. It seems to be the result from tonight. And yes, 3.5 years was a long time. So disappointing, but we've got to see what happens next.
And finally, a Conservative voter. Did you expect the level of success that the Conservatives have had?
No, I think we were going to struggle to get past the 20 votes that was required, but it seems there's massive sea change, and primarily steered by the fact that individuals want to get Brexit done. They just want to get it done, and they also understand that good, tight budgeting, finance, investment is going to be needed in key services, which hopefully we're going to get.
Well, thank you all very much for joining me. And there you go, our map, which just shows exactly what has happened, the story of the night, and the real shrinking of the red wall stretching from one coast to the other of Great Britain.
Extraordinary picture, Sophie, and as soon as we get those last votes in from St Ives, you can probably go to bed, can't you? With us now is the National Coordinator for Momentum, Laura Parker, and the former Conservative Cabinet Minister, now independent candidate for London Mayor Rory Stewart. Welcome to both of you.
Morning.
Laura, this has been awful, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's not been the best night ever. Obviously a very, very disappointing result for Labour. I'm really hoping that the red wall has temporarily buckled rather than being permanently smashed. And I noticed that the Prime Minister did say something about Labour voters having lent their vote to the Conservatives. So, I very much believe this was about Brexit, and I hope we'll be able to bring those people back. But it has not been a great night.
Do you want to apologise to people for what has happened under your leader, because we've had absolutely nothing from the Labour leadership. When Ed Miliband lost in 2015, he said, "I take absolute and total responsibility for that defeat." We've heard nothing.
Well, I am certainly very sorry. I feel a huge responsibility to our activists in Momentum. We've mobilised thousands of people around the country. I mean, apart from my deep concern for the country itself, the thing that is making me saddest this morning is that sense of obligation that I think I feel to all the people who put their trust in us. I'm sure we'll be hearing more from party leaders during the course of today, but of course it's a deeply disappointing result, and we do need, I mean, I think people have spoken about a period of reflection, and there has to be one now, because we have to understand what's happening.
Do you know what? Normally you would say absolutely, a period of reflection is what everyone needs, except you were warned so many times, so often, in such clear language, from your own MPs, from people who defected, from voters on the doorstep, from everyone who had tried to sell the Corbyn message and couldn't. What part of that could you not hear? Alan Johnson said last night to John Lansman, Corbyn was a disaster. He couldn't lead the working class out of a paper bag. Now, if your Labour leader can't do that, what is Labour for?
But this was the leader that took us to the largest increase in Labour's vote share since 1945,
that
just
was
2 years ago.
because your MPs had signed off on Article 50 to deliver Brexit at that point. It clearly wasn't what Corbyn was saying on the doorstep.
Well, I'm not sure where the evidence for that is. I mean, I think there's no denying that we've had a very difficult 2 years. I think Brexit has sucked the life out of politics. It's incredibly disempowering. We've wanted to talk about the NHS, to talk about wage stagnation, and we've not managed to cut through the Brexit noise. And it's quite clear that people up and down the country have been fed up.
The Brexit noise is everyone's noise. You could have decided to actually explain what the Brexit position was. He could have decided to show leadership on that rather than constant ambiguity the whole time. You lost 2.5 million voters in 2 years. How do you do that?
Well, I very much hope that we will get them back again when Brexit is done, if indeed the Prime Minister managed to do it, because I'm not so confident that he will either.
Do you accept that Momentum is a cult? That was Alan Johnson as well. Is it
No,
the end of Momentum?
Do you know what? I don't know if he's ever... I genuinely don't know how many Momentum members he's met, but if he came to our office, he would find it full of enthusiastic, positive, inclusive, largely young people. We've mobilised thousands of people across the party. We've had Labour MPs who would, under no stretch of the imagination, describe themselves as Corbynistas, who've come to Momentum. They've had us campaigning in their constituencies. Our videos were seen by 70 million viewers. That is not...
They clearly didn't like them enough to actually vote for Corbyn.
But that's not a cult, is it? That's way beyond the membership of Momentum. In fact, it's way beyond the membership of the party.
Maybe it's a bubble, not a cult. We're going to bring some tweets in from Margaret Hodge when we can make those work on the screen. But Rory, your take as things stand tonight, the moderates, people that you were supporting, the centre ground is what we would have called the One Nation, uniformly defeated.
Absolutely. So I think that the big challenge for British politics, as for European and indeed American politics, is to rebuild that centre ground. I think what's happening is people are realising that social media and other things mean that parties are tempted to campaign more and more on the extremes. The messages are getting simpler and simpler. There's less and less detail.
But it works. I mean, that's exactly what we've seen now. That works. A 3-word slogan works. A short manifesto works. Lack of detail works. Why would anyone try and do it the more complicated way now?
Because it's only by getting back to reality and detail that we can really start governing the country properly. So I think you're absolutely right. It's worked brilliantly well, far better than somebody like me predicted, probably because my prejudice is usually to try to talk about the practical, complicated details on the ground. I was very sceptical about this. Of course, it's true, it really does work. It works right across Europe, it's working across the United States, but in the end, a democracy is about reality. It's about getting people back to talking about practical things, about crime on their streets, about transport, about housing, and above all, the word how rather than what. How are you going to do this?
But isn't it interesting that actually what we've seen overnight is the importance of being affiliated to a party, that whether it was the MPs that left Labour or the MPs that left the Conservatives, you don't exist without that structure, and you're now outside the party that you could have remodelled and reshaped.
So I'm running as an independent, and I still believe strongly here in London that there is space for independence, that you want somebody who isn't affiliated to a party, who can challenge whoever's in government. But above all, because I think the future, actually, in many, many countries in the world is cities. I think these national governments are drawn by these campaigns into more and more extreme, more and more polarised positions. In cities around the world, it's really where the change happens, because it doesn't have to be so ideological, it doesn't have to be so party-driven. You can get on and do things quickly.
Let's go to some analysis from Sir John Curtis. Thank you both for the moment for now. We're going to talk to Sir John and look at the scoreboards as things stand. Let's just bring up where things are. The Conservative majority then, with everyone declared except the one Cornish seat in St Ives, 364 to Labour 203, and those dates that we keep coming back to, historic for each, the biggest win, biggest majority since Margaret Thatcher in 1987, and the biggest defeat since the defeat in 1983 they called the longest suicide note in history. Technically, I guess, John, this is an even longer suicide note for Labour, isn't it?
Well, that's, to be honest, a consequence of the different way in which the electoral system operated. Labour's share of the vote in 1983 was only 28%. This time, at least, they've managed to secure 33%. But the character of Labour's vote is so different from 1983. In 1983, Labour were insulated from the worst effects of the collapse of its support because it did relatively well in its strongholds in the north of England, in the Midlands, in more working class seats. Well, of course, this time, that's exactly the very kind of place where Labour have suffered most. So as a result, therefore, the relative weakness of its performance has been exaggerated to some degree by the ruthless way in which our electoral system operates. If you lose ground disproportionately in those places where you were previously strong, you're going to end up losing quite a lot of seats.
So I guess any thought of electoral systems and change is now completely out of the window for another generation at least, because this has served the Conservative Party at least very well.
You're quite right that there is little prospect of change happening during the term of this Conservative government, but I think we can probably anticipate that this result is going to give a new stimulus to the debate about electoral reform, because the level of support for the Conservatives and the Brexit Party, the two parties that are in favour of leaving the European Union, amounts in this election to 47%. Rather less than the support that's been given to the parties in favour of a second referendum, which is around 52%. And indeed, we know from polling evidence, and we have to say the polls were reasonably accurate this time, so there's no particular reason to disbelieve this. We know from the polls that it looks as though at the moment there is a small lead in favour of Remain. So I think we can anticipate that there will be an argument about A, whether or not an election was the best way of settling the Brexit impasse as opposed to referendum, and B, an appreciation of how, if you hold an election, it's not necessarily which is the more popular idea that's going to win, but rather which of the two ideas in this case ends up being the better organised. And the truth is the Leave side were better organised because they piled in behind the Conservative vote, whereas although Labour did manage to squeeze the Liberal Democrat vote during the campaign, there was still 20% of the Remain vote going to the Liberal Democrats. That fractured the Remain vote, and that was the foundation of Boris Johnson's victory.
John, thanks very much indeed. Back with John when we get that full complete board. But right now we're going to Belfast to get reaction to some interesting results there. We're going to have a look at Christian Fraser's board first to see what the story of the night has been in Northern Ireland. A couple of big scalps there, not least Nigel Dodds. Christian.
Yeah, a really interesting night in Northern Ireland. Remember that in the last Parliament, the DUP had a very strong hand. They had 10 seats. They were the voice of Brexit from Northern Ireland. They're down 2. And for the first time ever, you've got Sinn Féin and the SDLP, 2 Nationalist Party, 9 plays 8. The Nationalists more seats than the Unionists. That's the first time that's happened. The DUP is still the biggest party in terms of seats and vote share, but really the big winner of the night, the Alliance. Now, they are cross-party. They sit neutral on the constitutional question. Much more palatable for Unionists to vote for the Alliance than to vote for a Nationalist Party. So let's have a look at those 3 parties. You mentioned Nigel Dodds. This, I can't say it strongly enough, is a political earthquake. So within Belfast North is the Ardoyne estate, Catholic Ardoyne estate, scene of a lot of the violence during the Troubles. You've got Unionist and Nationalist communities living together. The Catholic community is growing in size. So Sinn Féin really wanted this. Nigel Dodds has had it for 20 years. John Finucane who has taken it is the son of Pat Finucane, the solicitor who represented IRA members. He was gunned down by the UDA in 1989. And you can see what's happened on the night. They have taken, it's an alliance, a Remain alliance in this seat. So SDLP stood aside. Sinn Féin have taken it from the DUP, a 5% vote share change. This one's interesting, North Down. I told you they'd done well, the alliance. This is the one seat they picked up. Stephen Farry's the deputy leader. DUP had fought hard for this, but they've been punished for getting into bed with Boris Johnson. People in Northern Ireland don't like the Boris Johnson Brexit deal, and the alliance has put on 36%. And this is the final seat I want to show you, because this is really fascinating, Emily. Foyle, OK? Home to Derry, London Derry. So for many, many years, it had been SDLP. It was the seat, in fact, of John Hume, the former leader of the SDLP. And then it was taken in 2017 by Alicia McCallion, who was the London Derry mayor, only by 169 votes. But look at that. 17,000. This is one of the biggest swings of the night. OK, you've got a swing here of 18%. We know that there has been resurgent paramilitary activity in Derry, London Derry. Is that what we're talking about here? Remember the death of Lyra McKee, the journalist who was shot? Is this a reaction from the nationalist community in Derry, London Derry, to what has happened? And is that why the SDLP got in?
Christian, fascinating to see some of those played out. Thanks very much indeed. Well, let's catch up now with Anita McVeigh, who's in Belfast. And I think it was the former UUP leader who said that they'd spent years fearing the Irish nationalists, and then they realised that they had more to fear from English nationalists. Is that the sense that certainly the DUP sold their soul for nothing?
It's a really interesting story here, Emily. Yes, some really big stories coming out of Northern Ireland overnight. If we look, first of all, at individual personalities and in terms of name recognition, Nigel Dodds, who Christian was talking about, obviously a DUP deputy leader, party Westminster leader, intimately involved in those discussions, confidence and supply discussions with Theresa May and discussions with Boris Johnson, losing his Belfast North seat after almost 20 years. And that going to John Finucane of Sinn Féin. So a shift there from a Brexit supporting unionist to a Remain supporting nationalist, and that very much reflects the broader picture here in Northern Ireland, where we now have a majority of MPs who are nationalist and a majority of MPs who support Remain. But let's discuss that point that you were making and the broader issues here with Sam McBride, who's the political editor of the newsletter. Sam, morning to you. I mean, let's get your overview of what's happened overnight. You were saying some really sensational stories.
So this has been a calamitous result for the DUP in particular, and for unionism in general. This has been a night where they have lost, in the DUP's case, 2 seats which were very important to them, particularly Nigel Dodds. He was a key strategist for the DUP, one of their big strategic brains, as well as their Westminster leader. They have seen their influence at Westminster evaporate overnight. They have seen Scotland go towards nationalism. They have seen, for the first time in the history of the Northern Ireland state, a majority of nationalists, as you say, return to Westminster. And whereas this might be seen as a party political catastrophe for the DUP, it's much wider than that. This is not votes going from the DUP to the Ulster Unionist Party or some other unionist party. This is votes leaving unionism as an ideology, either by not coming out to vote and therefore nationalists being elected, or going to the centrist Alliance Party.
Votes leaving unionism as an ideology because of Brexit? I mean, Emily was making the point that there have been comments suggesting that whereas unionists might have thought the main fear they used to have was from Irish nationalism, it's been from English nationalism, actually, that's making the difference now.
I think that the DUP have been particularly slow to realise how vulnerable they are to English nationalism in particular. Some of them did realise it, some of them did not back Brexit, but there was a sense that they blindly followed Boris Johnson even after he betrayed them earlier this year. They then, in Arlene Foster's case, basically backed him to be leader, and then backed him for a second time and were betrayed a second time. So there are very difficult questions for the leadership of the DUP at this point. Arlene Foster will be under intense pressure because she has presided over 3 years, if you like, of a series of calamities. This is perhaps the gravest, and the question now is, will she survive in these circumstances, having done so up until now?
A very interesting question, Sam. Thank you very much, Sam McBride from the newsletter. And now that Northern Ireland has 3 Remain MPs who will take their seats at Westminster on those green benches, unlike the Sinn Féin MPs who have an abstentionist policy, the question is, given Boris Johnson's big majority, whether those 3 Northern Ireland Remain MPs, 2 SDLP, 1 Alliance, can actually make that point of view heard with that big majority for Boris Johnson. Back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Anita. They certainly won't be part of the maths this time around, that's for sure. Well, joining us now, Gavin Barwell, former Downing Street Chief of Staff to Theresa May. Dan Carden, the Labour Shadow International Development Secretary. Welcome to you, Dan. And Nigel Farage, the Brexit Party leader. And Dan, I'm going to start with you, if I can. Do you blame Jeremy Corbyn?
No, I don't. It's a heartbreaking result for the Labour Party, but I think it shows that the Brexit divisions across the country have not been solved, and I think we've paid a price for that. I mean, every Labour MP who lost their seat this morning won their seat under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership in 2017. The difference was we had a manifesto that accepted the referendum results back in 2017, and it's that position that has slowly changed over the last couple of years.
And it shouldn't have changed, you're saying?
I think moving towards a second referendum and making ourselves look like the Remain party, we've paid a price for that in our working class heartlands up north and across the Midlands.
Because even that strategy wasn't clear. I mean, the extraordinary thing is that from John McDonnell at sort of 10 past 10 last night to you at 10 o'clock this morning, the message has just been one of, it seems, sort of absolute denial, which is it was all about Brexit and we just weren't capable of fighting the Tories on Brexit. I mean, what happened to your party last night? What happened with the leadership? What happened to ignoring everyone telling you how badly you were going to do because there was no trust in Jeremy Corbyn and no sense of what he was about? At what stage do you start saying this was an appalling defeat and we've really got to look at ourselves, because we were warned about this all the way along?
Well, of course we do have to look at ourselves and review our policies, review everything about the last couple of years and where the Labour Party goes forward. I don't think we lost Labour heartlands because we were promising
You lost 2.5 million votes in 2 years. I mean, that must be a record, isn't it?
We're saying, I don't think we lost Labour heartlands because we were promising to renationalise the NHS or invest in our communities or promising a £10 an hour minimum wage.
So you didn't win them. Why
we
not,
lost trust over the issue of Brexit, and in the end, whereas we thought we could move on from the issue of Brexit, have a radical, bold agenda that would hopefully move us away from that issue and seek to unite the country.
So do you blame the sort of vocal Remainers on your front bench then? I'm just trying to get a sense of, at some stage you must be thinking we shouldn't have done that, Emily Thornberry shouldn't have spoken out, Keir Starmer shouldn't have spoken out, or Jeremy Corbyn was toxic and we should have listened to all those people who told us that. Which is it?
Well, in a way, it's both, Emily, because I mean, I travelled around the marginal seats a lot during this campaign, and of course, Jeremy Corbyn was raised by people
for being toxic.
But when you ask people why they weren't voting for Jeremy Corbyn or why they wouldn't vote for him, they couldn't give you an answer. And Jeremy is someone who's been smeared and attacked by the media ruthlessly for the last 4 years. It's not just me that says that. It's Loughborough University, it's the LSE, it's others.
Genuinely,
when they look at the media coverage of Jeremy, and
you think it's a media problem, do you?
I'm just saying there's actually reports and educational documents into this, and the bias against the Labour Party and Jeremy is clear.
Everyone who stands faces scrutiny, and I think Tony Blair would probably say he was smeared and attacked by the media when he was Prime Minister, and he still got 3 terms in office.
In those marginal seats, there were letters after letters attacking Jeremy Corbyn's in every way possible. You know, I don't think we've ever seen a leader of a political party attacked in such a way that Jeremy Corbyn has put up with for the last 4 years.
He hasn't said, I'm going, I recognise that I'm the root cause of the problem, I've got to allow Labour to move on. Would you like him to go straight away and allow you to choose a new leader and try and start again?
No, I want us to take our time. I mean, the situation we're faced with now is 5 years in opposition. We need to reflect. I'm keen that
it could be 10 to be honest, on the majority that size.
Many of these lessons, but let's not lay this just at Jeremy Corbyn's door.
Gavin, I wonder, when you reflect on what happened overnight and you see what a different strategy Boris Johnson ran to the one that Theresa May ran that obviously took you out of your seat in Battersea. Whether you think that's a complete sea change now in how an election campaign is run?
So I make 2 points. I think, first of all, if Theresa was sitting here, she would say the 2017 campaign was a disaster. You know, the manifesto was wrong and the campaign wasn't right, and she takes responsibility for that. So that definitely is a difference. You can't deny that. But I don't think that's the biggest difference. And your correspondent earlier was saying the Conservative vote share in this election is 1 percentage point higher than she achieved in 2017. The big difference is the Labour vote share. And the reason for that, and I think Dan made one, you know, I don't agree. I think Corbyn was a huge issue, as well as Brexit. Right, but I do think he made one fair point, which is there are Labour MPs who won their seats in 2017 because of Jeremy Corbyn. So how do you explain that? And my answer would be that in 2017, although the Westminster bubble knew who Jeremy Corbyn was, the electorate didn't. And he had a good campaign, and he delivered didn't win, but a pretty good result for Labour. 2 years later, people know what they think of Jeremy Corbyn. And whilst it's definitely true that Brexit was a factor, that's why the results are much better for the Conservatives in the Midlands and the North, it is undeniable from all the accounts you hear from everybody right across the country that there are concerns about anti-Semitism, there are concerns about national security.
Forgive me, but because I want to hear from you about your party, because your party morphed into something different this time, and you have been a chief of staff, you know, not on an election campaign, but right next to a prime minister. I wonder whether you look at the way that this campaign happened. Would you have run that campaign? Would you have run a campaign that said to Boris Johnson, don't come off message, even if somebody asks you what your girlfriend wants for Christmas, just say the message, don't talk to the public, hide in a fridge rather than facing a camera, dress up in photo ops rather than explaining things in a manner. Would you have been proud of that as a strategist?
So I think if you're involved in the strategy of running elections, it's a really difficult balance to strike because you have to have message clarity. One of the reasons he's won is he has managed to put together a coalition of people who passionately believe in what he's offering and want all this to happen, and others who maybe, like myself, campaign for Remain, but think people voted for this, it's a democracy, it should happen. And that Get Brexit Done slogan built that coalition. Now, on the other hand, voters do not like politicians not engaging and answering questions, and there's a real balance for anyone. When you're an active politician, you come on being interviewed by you, how much do you actually engage in trying to answer the question, and how much are you trying to get your message across? And
he looked
get
terrified.
that balance.
I mean, that was why he couldn't even be in the studios, because he looked terrified.
Getting that balance right is a really, really difficult thing. So, I mean, like my experience when I was housing minister, you'd go on to talk about the housing white paper, and the interview would often focus on one little policy and needle away to try and make a point on one, and your job is to go on and try and sell the overall policy. That's the difficulty for politics communicating in the modern media. We have to engage with your questions. We want viewers to think we're trying to properly answer your questions, but we also have a story we're trying. But we also have a story we're trying to tell. And I think that's the balance you've got to get right. But if you judge it by results, this is a huge personal triumph for him, this election result, and you've got to give him credit for that.
Nigel Farage, the country has now voted for a Brexit deal that you hate.
Yeah, I think if you said to people what was in the deal, they'd be mortified. But look, we've got Brexhaustion, 3.5 years on, a perception that Westminster is Remain, that they're against us, and you get a new Prime Minister comes along with, you know, a bit more optimism, a bit more energy, who says he's going to get Brexit done. It's very tempting. I mean, look, I think from my perspective, and I mean, I've wanted this for 25 years, the nightmare would have been a second referendum. I just think that would have done the country enormous damage, and I did what I could in this campaign to try and stop that from happening. We are going to get Brexit. It'll probably be half a loaf, but we are actually going to get Brexit.
You're a strange beast, aren't you, Nigel? I mean, in the midst of all this, you would have thought you'd be the happiest man alive, but you're the one saying it's a terrible deal and I hate it. You have no power. You have no MPs.
I've just said to you, I'm pleased with the result. You know, I didn't want a second referendum. I think a Corbyn government would have been disastrous for the economy. I'm pleased with the result.
Why did you take down the rest of your MPs from standing if you were more passionate about getting something through? I mean, I don't understand how you're pleased with the result, but it doesn't make sense. Either try and get a better one by standing more, or take away all of them.
In the south of England and the southwest of England, where the Liberal Democrats were serious challenges to the Conservatives in many seats, in that part of the country, the vote we were going to take would have come from the Conservatives.
You don't think the Lib Dems were a threat overnight?
I think the Lib Dems would have won a lot of seats.
Without the Brexit Party?
I think the Liberal Democrats would have won a lot of seats in Surrey, Hampshire, Devon, Dorset, Cornwall if we'd stood. I have no doubt about that. So the decision to stand down, yeah, I'm not happy with the deal. I make no bones about that. But I prefer to have Boris Johnson doing Brexit than a second referendum, and that's why I took the decision.
And we've seen the tweet from from Donald Trump overnight. The United States will now be free to strike a massive new trade deal after Brexit. So should Labour be worried that everything is on the table, the NHS on the table,
that's all been dealt with. I mean, the whole Labour campaign on the NHS...
But you're going, so what does that mean?
Here's the problem. If we go through with Boris's deal as it is, there'll be no trade deal with America until at least 2023, if ever. And that's why how Boris does Brexit is very, very important. If we're too closely tied to the EU, there'll be no American deal.
Thank you all very much indeed. We go to Sedgefield now, which has a Conservative MP for the first time since 1931. You'll know it, of course, from the Tony Blair years. The BBC's Anna Foster is there for us, and this was one of those, I think, that we all wondered about as soon as the exit poll came out. Anna, what is the sense there today?
It is a sense people have woken up here, and there is a real sense of disbelief, I think, because this was, of course, Tony Blair's constituency. He won this seat in 1983. And just to give you an idea of the numbers, because they tell a really strong story, back in 1997, when there was that landslide Labour victory, Tony Blair had a Labour majority here of more than 25,000. Sedgefield has woken up this morning with a Conservative MP who has a majority of 4,500. It is incredible to think that not just this seat, but a whole swathe of the Tees Valley and parts of Durham, former coal mining areas, former steelwork areas like Redcar, have turned Conservative. Now, Chris Lloyd is with me, a veteran reporter from the Northern Echo, the local newspaper here. And we were just talking, Chris, about the way that this was absolute Labour heartland country. This is where Tony Blair, at the peak of his power, brought George Bush, the US president. It didn't get bigger than that.
No, this was his power base, really, and it was it helped him shape what became New Labour, very similar to where we are now, where the left-wing Labour Party in 1983 falling to an enormous defeat, and this area helped him rediscover what Labour meant for traditional kind of working class communities, and it became the focus of world attention here. We even had George Bush visiting just down there to the pub, the Dun Cow, for fish and chips. It was an amazing day where we had armed policemen on all of these roofs around here, and I was lucky enough to be the only journalist in the pub to witness that.
And if somebody had tapped you on the shoulder that day and said, in 2019, Sedgefield will have a Conservative MP, it's hard to believe.
It is hard to believe, but times are changing. I think it's very interesting what it says about the mindset of the Tees Valley, of the North East. There's kind of been a tidal wave of Toryism sweeping down the Tees Valley, but people are now have always been looking for a reason not to vote for Labour. They couldn't vote for the Conservatives because generations would spin in their graves, but now the mindset is beginning to move on. We're no longer defined by the past. We're no longer defined by being former coal mining, former steel making. We do have modern industries, digital industries, and so that has kind of come into the way they're voting.
Yeah, it's a real change, and not just here in Sedgefield, replicated right across the North East. A big night for the Conservatives here, a disastrous night for Labour.
Anna, thank you very much indeed. Anna there for us in Sedgefield. Now a Conservative gain. Well, let's get reaction from the city. Our business editor, Simon Jack, is at an investment bank in London's Canary Wharf. There are all sorts of hijinks that the pound was meant to have been doing yesterday on a result we still didn't know. What's it doing today, Simon? How are things?
The markets gave Boris Johnson a round of applause in their own way. The pound was very significantly higher overnight on the publication of that Brexit poll. And this morning, when the stock markets open, politically sensitive shares like banks, utilities, the building companies, they all went rocketing up into double digits in some cases. So I've got Fabrice Montaigne here, the chief UK economist here at Barclays. And explain to us why the markets are giving such a cheer this morning.
Yes, good morning. I think much of what we're seeing this morning has to do with the fact that
We have been able to peel away one layer of uncertainty. You know, what businesses tell us is that they can't operate when rules constantly change. And their questions have partly been answered today. We have a functioning government in a functioning parliament that has the mandate to take the UK out of the EU. So that would allow some businesses to re-engage with the economy.
But you've got a mandate to deliver a Brexit that most businesses don't want, and also most investors are quite nervous about.
Absolutely, but make no mistake, nobody is saying here Brexit is good news. I guess what the markets are expressing is that an orderly Brexit is better than a disorderly Brexit. Where you're getting at is that very quickly in the course of next year, as we start negotiating trade agreements and we move closer to the deadline, businesses will be asking the question, so now what? How will we be able to trade after that?
Great, thank you very much indeed, Fabrice. He's now got the time and the power to do whatever he wants, and some people are thinking he'll pivot, maybe gives him the licence to pursue Brexit however he sees fit.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. Simon Jack in the city there for us now. Good morning. You join us live at Westminster, where the Conservatives have won their biggest majority since 1987. It is 10 o'clock, and as you join us live at Westminster, the Conservatives have won their biggest majority since 1987. Boris Johnson's gamble to hold a December election has paid off with a majority of 78. The Prime Minister called it...
With this mandate and this majority, we will at last be able to do what?
Prime Minister's now inside number 10, having pledged to earn the support of people who, in his words, may have lent him their vote. An awful night for Labour, losing 59 seats, many of them in places the party has held for decades. Jeremy Corbyn said the results were very disappointing.
I want to also make it clear that I will not lead the party in any future general election campaign. I will discuss with our party to ensure there is a process now.
How did he pull it off? Boris Johnson's here inside number 10, savouring the moment, preparing for government for the next 5 years.
And we're live at Buckingham Palace, awaiting the arrival of Boris Johnson here a little bit later this morning when he comes to formally ask the Queen for permission to form the next government.
Liberal Democrat leader Jo Swinson quits after she loses her own seat to the SNP and the party fails to improve its position at Westminster.
For millions of people in our country, these results will bring dread and dismay, and people are looking for hope.
A strong result for the SNP, who now hold 48 seats out of the 59 in Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon says it sends a clear message for a second independence referendum.
That independence referendum that was very much at the heart of the SNP's campaign, there is a renewed, refreshed, strengthened mandate for that.
We're delving deep into the numbers. We're going to look at Scotland in the next hour on another fantastic night for the SNP. And what did go wrong for the Liberal Democrats? So much optimism 5 weeks ago, and yet they could finish in a worse position than they were in 2017.
On our giant map, each constituency has been made exactly the same size. One hexagon for one MP, and it really shows the balance of power. Labour's red wall dramatically shrunk, and Scotland has gone SNP yellow.
Well, the result of the election means big change in the House of Commons and for the country. The UK will now leave the European Union by the end of next month. We'll be speaking to the main parties and we'll bring you all the events and the reaction from here throughout the day. And a very good morning to you. Welcome to viewers here in the UK on BBC One and the BBC News channel, and around the globe on BBC World News. Here at Westminster, the Conservatives have taken control of the House of Commons after an overwhelming win in the general election. The Tories have a majority of 78, with just one seat still to declare. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has called it a new dawn and said he now has a mandate to get the UK to leave the European Union at the end of January. No ifs, no buts. Jeremy Corbyn said Labour's result was a disappointing night and that he would not fight a future general election. The Liberal Democrats had a terrible night as the party leader Jo Swinson lost her seat and quit. But the SNP did well, coming close to sweeping the board in Scotland. Let's take a look at the result as they stand. So the Conservatives winning 364 seats, that's up 47. Labour took 203. They're down 59 seats. The SNP have 48 MPs. They made an increase of 13. The Liberal Democrats just 11. They're down 1. The DUP 8, down 2, and Sinn Féin, who don't take their seats, 7. This is the vote share in Great Britain, so you can see how that reads across. The Conservatives then on 45% share of the vote. Labour on 33%. The Liberal Democrats on 12, 4, the SNP on 4, just up a tiny bit, and the Greens 3%. The Brexit Party is on 2%, and we'll bring you all the reaction, speak to all the main parties and look at what the result means for Westminster and for Brexit. Do stay with us, stay with me here throughout the day. Right now, though, we go to Clive Myrie, who is in Downing Street, and there are procedural things that must happen, Clive, almost before the magnitude of the night has sunk in, preparations being made for the next steps.
Indeed, Boris Johnson has been here now for the last couple of hours after he gave that victory speech not far from here. And his chief advisor and election guru, I suppose you could say, Dominic Cummings, he arrived about an hour ago. And the big question, of course, is how did they do it? Their campaign, so successful overnight. Remember those votes in Parliament that Boris Johnson lost day after day after day. Lots of worry and concern within the Conservative government of Boris Johnson that things were slipping out of his hands. But Dominic Cummings making it clear to his advisors that, look, keep calm. We're all going to be little Fonzies, he said. Keep calm, keep cool. These are skirmishes that we are losing. The big battle is to come. And they have indeed triumphed pretty spectacularly, as we've seen overnight. As you say, a lot of procedure still to go through. Boris Johnson, at some point, will leave number 10 here, head to Buckingham Palace to formally ask the Queen to form the next government. This, of course, potentially Boris Johnson's home for the next 5 years. But what a night it has been. Let's get the story of the evening with our political correspondent, Jonathan Blake.
A convincing victory, winning here in Blythe Valley and in constituencies across the UK. The Conservatives now have a massive majority. This morning, Boris Johnson told his supporters they had caused a political earthquake.
Well, we did it. We did it. We pulled it off, didn't we? We pulled it off. We broke the deadlock. We ended the gridlock. We smashed the roadblock.
And after turning once solid Labour seats Tory blue, he promised not to let voters down.
Your hand may have quivered over the ballot paper as before you put your cross in the Conservative box. And you may intend to return to Labour next time round. And if that is the case, I am humbled that you have put your trust in me and that you have put your trust in us.
We did it.
Overnight, new Conservative MPs were elected throughout Labour's heartlands, the losing side looking on as seat after seat fell away.
Are you going to resign, Mr Corbyn?
There's no hiding from the scale of Labour's defeat. Jeremy Corbyn says he won't fight another election as leader. His supporters blame Brexit, but there's a fight for the future of the party.
We tried our best to have a policy of principle where we bring the country back together again, both Remain and Leavers, but that obviously proved to be impossible.
You lost your seat, Ms Swinson.
Disaster for the Liberal Democrats. Their leader had lost her seat, her party and its supporters in despair.
For millions of people in our country, these results will bring dread and dismay, and people are looking for hope.
Sheer joy for the Scottish National Party, winning seats, helping the leader make her case.
I don't pretend that every single person that voted SNP yesterday will necessarily support independence, but there has been a strong endorsement in this election of Scotland having a choice over our future.
Re-elected, Boris Johnson has returned to Downing Street. His election gamble has given him a new mandate to govern. Jonathan Blake, BBC News.
And what a mandate it is. Let's join our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, who's with me. Norman, let's talk about bubbles and silos. Over the last 5 weeks, I have travelled this country from Inniskillen in Northern Ireland, West Wales, Croydon, Crewe. I spent a lot of time in Leeds, Doncaster and Bishop Auckland up in County Durham. Now, I could see what was going on, and I'm not the brightest tool in the box. If I could see that, why couldn't Labour?
I think the truth is many of those around Mr Corbyn closed their ears to what voters were saying. They just simply refused to pick up on what many Labour MPs, candidates, were saying, namely that Mr Corbyn was a massive, massive problem on the doorstep. And yes, Brexit was an issue, but the overriding problem was Jeremy Corbyn. And I formed the impression, just going to rallies with him, and you'd see these terribly enthusiastic young supporters, that they were all talking to each other, feeding off each other, and their views were sort of rebounding off each other, and then they convinced each other that that was the world view, that everyone shared their enthusiasm for Jeremy Corbyn. The question now is whether last night was a sufficient reality check. And I'm not sure it was, because if you listen to what they're saying, well, actually, no, Jeremy Corbyn, he was not the problem. Our manifesto was very popular. And, in a way, it seems to me it's actually worse for Labour now than it was in 1983, because in the wake of 1983, after Michael Foot's disaster, the party pretty quickly realised that they couldn't, in effect, accuse the electorate of having got it wrong. They had got it wrong, and they had to change. The question is there now an appetite in Labour to change, or are the Corbynistas who control the party, they control the party structure, they are the membership, do they double down, dig in, choose someone in time to replace Mr Corbyn, who is in the model of Mr Corbyn, and carry on with their current agenda? In other words, whether they continue basically to close their ears to what voters in their traditional loyal heartlands have said.
All right, Norman, thank you. Norman Smith, our assistant political editor there. And with that, it's back to you, Emily.
Clive, thanks very much indeed. Well, Norman, they're talking about whether there was appetite to change in the Labour Party. We're going to talk to Ian McNicol, former General Secretary of the Labour Party, in a second. We'll also get reaction to the Conservative victory from business. Caroline Fairbairn, Director General of the CBI, is here, and Lord Newby speaking for the Lib Dems on what has been a pretty tough night for both your parties, actually. Ian McNicol, if I can pull up Laura Kuenssberg's tweet first of all, which gives us a sense of perhaps where the Corbyn mindset is now. She understands that Mr Corbyn is expected to set out a bit more of process for his departure later this morning, doesn't intend to resign, plans to stay in place until the leadership context can be held, which realistically may not mean a new Labour leader until April. In your opinion, is this what Labour needs?
No, I think we need to actually go into a leadership election now. It's not just the fact that we've lost 4 elections in a row now. The bit that's heartbreaking about it is that in this election we've gone further back than we were in 1983 under Michael Foot. So, we've tried it. For those of us who've been out on the doors and talking to people, yes, Brexit was an issue, but Jeremy was a bigger issue in many places around the country.
Does that read like a man who gets it?
Well, if what Laura is saying is correct, then no. Yes, a period of reflection, but we have Brexit coming down the line, and if anyone thinks that Brexit is actually going to be delivered by the end of January or by the end of December 2020, they're kidding themselves.
Yeah, explain to us why he thinks he is the answer or the caretaker or the moderating force that takes you. I'm asking genuinely now. Yeah. Is it that he still has ambitions for momentum and his wing of the party to be in charge? Is it a reluctance to accept that strategy, that whole ideology hasn't worked? Or does he genuinely think it's the responsible thing to do, that you don't quit the flock as David Cameron did after the referendum.
Well,
what do you think?
As Ed Miliband did as well. No, I think it's the ideology, and the way. So it's not just Jeremy. It's the wider Corbynism in the politics round about that have helped lead us to this terrible result. What's more important for many of them is that they continue with that ideology, even if that puts us in a worse electoral position and a worse position in terms of being able to hold this government to account over the coming months and years.
What was interesting is, I mean, you talk about ideology, but it was also about having a group that was in their own bubble. Yeah. We've seen now that Labour was a party of cities, not towns. Yeah. So how did they manage to ignore all that, to lose all the working class places that were towns?
I think there are a number of reasons that we lost trust. So the manifesto, there are a number of parts of the manifesto that were really good, really important in terms of protecting people and protecting communities. But much of that was lost.
He said it was about free things. Yes. You know, you can't just keep offering people free things. You have to actually give them a sense of direction and aspiration and change.
But many of those sort of good, solid Labour issues were lost, exactly as Alan Johnson said, in this bigger bubble of let's give out money here, there and everywhere. And you cannot do that in today's, with the electorate. You need to deliver an agenda that can deliver for the whole of the country, and we just did not do that this time, and it's just heartbreaking.
The city, Karen, was petrified of a Corbyn government. Now, that should have, in a way, I guess, emboldened people to say, well, maybe this is going to be a sort of fairer system. People don't always love what the city loves. But what is the response today from business to what we have?
Well, I mean, business, as you know, has been desperate for clarity and certainty for 3.5 years now. And this result does begin to answer some questions. You know, it does remove from the table some of the most damaging policies that were coming from the left that we think would have really damaged business. It also gives a timetable for Brexit, a sense that we will leave at the end of January and that we will have a transition period until the end of December. However, there are many questions still unanswered. And what a lot of businesses are saying to me this morning is the work starts now. And actually what they really want is reassurance that we won't have a no-deal Brexit next year, and actually there will be a reset in the relationship with business so that we get the kind of investments needed for productivity growth across the country.
This was the Prime Minister who may now have another 10 years, who notably told business what we know he said, F business.
Which we absolutely need a partnership between business and government to reskill the nation, to take our country green. These are massive challenges. So I think we will be looking, they will be looking, our members will be looking very hard at what happens over the next few weeks to see how business confidence can be restored.
Lord Newby, where did the Lib Dems start to go wrong?
The bizarre thing about this election from our point of view is that our vote share has gone up by more than 50%, more than any other party. Yet we've lost seats. Now,
you did know this wasn't a proportional system.
We did know, but it doesn't absolve the system ourselves from the truth. Our vote share has gone up by over 50%. We've gone back in seats, which is a big blow. I think going round talking to people, the two things that were absolutely pivotal in this election, both for us and the Labour Party, first of all, Boris Johnson managed to consolidate all the Brexit vote by moving towards the Brexit Party and in effect subsuming them. They've got 2%. Secondly, for people who were pro-Remain, for many of them, they were more scared of a Corbyn government than they were of leaving the EU. And so you got up and down the country people saying to me, we're strong Remainers, but actually, you know, we couldn't manage a Corbyn government. And whatever reassurance we tried to give that there wouldn't be a Corbyn government supported by us didn't work.
But the Remainers also have to look, I mean, it's an odd term to use now because there clearly isn't going to be a sort of Remain option. But I was watching the election from 2017 as a reminder of what people were saying there. And it's extraordinary. If you go back just 2 years, we had ruled out from the commentariat and from politicians, ruled out a hard Brexit, ruled out Scottish independence, ruled out resurgence of the SNP. There was a time when the Remainer part of Parliament and the Lords included in that could have actually taken the bull by the horns and been a force to be reckoned with, and that was frittered away over indicative votes and do we want Norway or customs or single market or a bit of everything or a second referendum. There was a moment, wasn't there, where actually Brexit might have been stopped by parties like yours, and it just went through the gap.
The killer was the vote on the second reading of the withdrawal bill when 19 Labour MPs voted with the government. That's the point at which any hope of having a Remainer, cross-party Remainer success in the Commons finished. In the Lords, we've worked extremely well together. We've had big Remainer majorities at all points because we've worked together. That wasn't possible in the Commons. I would argue that this was because it was impossible for us, however hard we tried, to work with the current Labour leadership. They just didn't want it. But whatever the reason, you're absolutely right. The Remain side of the argument didn't get its act together, and we paid a very heavy price.
Thank you all very much indeed. We're going to the piazza now, and there's a woman who's very keen to see a result in front of St Ives. I imagine that one hexagon, blue or yellow or possibly red, who knows, to be filled in at the very bottom corner, southwest corner of the map, Sophie. But you can show us the patterns that have formed there under what we've seen overnight.
Well, have a look at all these hexagons now. We are still waiting for that one in St Ives, but you can really get a good idea now of where the balance of power lies. Each constituency has been made into the same size, one hexagon, one MP. All these red tiles here are Labour MPs, most of them in London here. Not much has changed in the south of England, but it is here, up in the north of England, starting in the northeast Wales, where the dramatic changes have taken place overnight. All these blue tiles, they were Labour marginals, they've gone to the Conservatives. And Labour's red wall has shrunk dramatically, cracks in it, blue tiles popping up all the way through it. And something I couldn't do last night was walk from one coast to the other along blue Conservative seats, but I can do that now. And one of the big reasons for that, some of these Labour seats like Wakefield here, which have been in Labour hands since 1932, they have gone blue, and these seats had voted to leave the European Union. Chris Morris from our BBC Reality Check, Brexit clearly played a huge role in flipping these seats blue. What happens now?
Well, the Prime Minister now has a lot of promises to keep. I think we now know pretty much for certain we will leave the EU on the 31st of January, and that's going to be symbolically, legally, a really important day. But after that, there are further promises. Number one, to negotiate a trade deal with the EU in pretty much record time before the end of next year, when a post-Brexit transition period runs out. That's going to be difficult to do if the Prime Minister also wants the freedom to diverge from the EU rules and regulations that we currently follow. So that's promise number one. Promise number two, he said he won't extend that post-Brexit transition period. So if a trade deal isn't ready in time, what does he do? Does he break the promise to extend, or does he leave with a new version of no deal? So there's a lot of hurdles for him beyond the 31st of January. At the moment, clearly the focus is on that. And as I say, it will be an important day. Legally we'll have left, but the whole of the future relationship will still be up for grabs.
I'm going to borrow your microphone because I have some voters with me down here who have joined us on our giant map. A Conservative voter, Prime Minister's promise, get Brexit done. You're confident he will do it?
I hope so. I mean, I was an unenthusiastic Conservative voter. I was undecided right until the end.
So what changed your mind?
I think, to use the horrible phrase, to get Brexit done, I just want clarity, and I want us to be able to focus on other things. I want us to be able to put money into public services, and I hope that gaining traditional Labour voting areas will encourage the current government to put money into things like the NHS and education, because this is where the money really needs to go. So I hope Boris can sort Brexit and that we can move forward and heal the divisions.
A Labour voter here, you must be very disappointed tonight.
I am. Locally, Labour were able to retain the 2 seats, but nationally, I think that they just haven't been able to, first of all, get the votes. They need to look at the reasons why, need to listen to people. What is it that we need? Get the basics right.
And finally, a voter, an SNP voter. Now, what a night for the SNP in Scotland. It has gone almost completely yellow. What does it mean for the union, do you think?
Well, I think we are in the end game of this union, because all you need to do is look at this map and, does it look like a united kingdom? Clearly the majority of people in Scotland, like me, don't wish to be part of this disastrous far-right project that is just going to be awful for so many people, for women, for children, for people living in poverty. In Scotland, we aspire to be a progressive and inclusive and a welcoming nation. And I think this map demonstrates very clearly that until Scotland has the opportunity and can claim its legal right to at least to ask the question again, I think, we're in for a time of crisis and conflict in all corners of these islands.
Extraordinary times ahead. Well, thank you all very much for joining us. But there you go, Emily. You do get a very good idea of where the balance of power across the UK now lies.
You can't stop looking at that one, so it's just absolutely fascinating when you see them all in equal size. But right now we are going to the constituency of Lee in Greater Manchester, which was former Labour MP Andy Burnham's old seat. He's now, of course, the mayor of Manchester. Before he became the Manchester mayor, it's been won by the Conservatives for the first time ever. Judith Moritz is there for us. I wonder how that feels, Judith.
Extraordinary, as you say. This has never been a Conservative seat, and it's been in Labour hands since 1922, nearly the full century as a red constituency. Last night, James Grundy took the seat for the Tories. He now has a 2,000 majority here. Joanne Platt, who had previously held it for Labour, was previously here just on top of a 9,000 majority. So there's been that swing, and this is one of 5 red wall seats in this immediate area which have done the same thing. We've seen similar results in Bolton North East, Bury North, Bury South and Hayward and Middleton. So people here are, to one extent, shell-shocked, thinking that this is an extraordinary development. At the same time, there are plenty of voters who've been telling us that this is the result they wanted. This was a 64% leave voting constituency. It's very clear, plenty of people here who voted on the basis of Brexit. There are also voters here telling us that it was the Jeremy Corbyn effect. They didn't feel comfortable voting him in as a Labour leader. They did not want to see him as Prime Minister. And they've also talked about Andy Burnham. You mentioned him there, one of the town's previous MPs. He, of course, challenged Corbyn for the Labour leadership unsuccessfully. And one man here has said to us, it could have all been so different if he had won that leadership campaign. We think he would still be the local MP here now. As it is, Lee, for the first time, a Tory constituency.
Judith, thank you. It'll take a while to let that sink in, no doubt. The President of the European Council, Charles Michel, has congratulated Boris Johnson on his victory. We're starting to get some reaction now from Europe and on what this means, of course, for Brexit and the plans for Brexit now. We've heard from Charles Michel, who said he expects And EU now expects as soon as possible there'll be a vote in Parliament on the exit deal that's already been negotiated. We've also heard from Leo Varadkar in Ireland. Next steps is to ratify that withdrawal agreement, which guarantees no hard border, and keen to work very hard with Johnson to get the Executive Assembly up and running again in Northern Ireland. Let's go to our Europe correspondent, Damien Grammaticus in Brussels. And I guess there is probably a sense of relief where you are, that at least they have some direction, some clear mandate from this country now, Damien.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, those comments were being made by EU leaders arriving here for summit talks in Brussels. They're all in there now. And the one thing that they were desperate for was a sense of clarity so that things could move forward. And that's exactly what Leo Varadkar, the Irish Taoiseach, was saying. He said he wanted to congratulate Boris Johnson, he said, on what was an enormous victory to him on a personal level. And he had said he wanted a decisive outcome from this election because EU leaders going in this morning saying they now see and they expect the UK to be able to put this deal to Parliament, the exit deal, and get it through so we can all move forward, or Brexit can move forward. But then what EU leaders are moving forward to, discussions right now, their approach to the future relationship and the talks on that will have to happen next year, and that is what they are hammering out.
Very interesting. Damien, we'll leave it there for now, but no doubt we're going to hear more from the EU negotiators as they wake up to these results and understand just what it means for the speed at which things may now happen. We've had a statement in from the Jewish Labour movement, which I'm going to read out to you. It says Labour's failure in this election lies squarely with the party's leadership because of the public's rejection of Corbyn as Prime Minister, the confused position on Brexit, or its total failure to tackle anti-Jewish racism. The party must truly listen. We're distraught that our courageous parliamentary chair, Ruth Smith, of course, who lost her seat last night, was not re-elected. She's represented the best of Labour over these past few years, unafraid and determined to hold the party leadership accountable for their failure to tackle anti-Semitism. And it goes on. After this historic election defeat, Jeremy Corbyn must stand down immediately, they're saying. His team and supporters who've been responsible for Labour's moral and political failures must take responsibility themselves for allowing 5 more years of Tory rule. And it's quite a strong statement, that, really, because you have heard Labour Labour spokesperson after Labour spokesperson simply refer to Brexit in the question, simply say this was a very different sort of election. It was a difficult one to sell on the doorstep, but many within the party, and certainly those who left the party, will tell you that the anti-Semitism was a big driver in what happened last night and in terms of the vote. We're going to take you right now to Downing Street, the scene just outside number 10, where the Jag is, I was going to say it's waiting, it looks as if it's heading off. No, it's just reversing into the right sort of position. This will be the car that Boris Johnson travels to Buckingham Palace in. And it's interesting to note that 2 years ago, Theresa May was setting off much later after that very, very complicated night in which she didn't get her mandate, she didn't get her majority. She needed to use another party, the votes of the DUP, in some shape or form to ask the Queen if she could form the next government, or rather to allow the Queen to ask her if she was able to form the next government. This time round, after a huge majority, the largest, as we know, for several decades, Boris Johnson can actually get on with this bit of, I don't know whether you'd call it protocol or pomp and ceremony, but certainly the trip to the palace can happen much more quickly. And we're just waiting for the Prime Minister to get into the car, head to the palace, and then we expect that audience with the Queen could be short, could last anywhere between 20 minutes, 40 minutes perhaps. It's sometimes a period of reflection for the new Prime Minister to lay out his plans, to think about what is ahead, and to allow the Queen herself to ask questions. We know that the Queen is very politically interested. She loves political gossip. She reads the notes that come from Westminster avidly, and he will be her 14th Prime Minister, and she will be able to talk him through what he intends to do, maybe get some sort of clarification from him on the timetable for Brexit, certainly, that lies ahead. Clive Murray is at Downing Street for us. Are you seeing any signs, any twitching yet of curtains there, Clive?
We're all twitching ourselves here in the media pack, just waiting across from the shiny black door. The grey Jag ready to go. As you mentioned, Emily, a very different atmosphere to the one 2 years ago when Theresa May, having called that election, she didn't need to call, but she called it and ended up losing her majority, having to work with the DUP in order to get anything done, frankly, in the House. Well, Boris Johnson leaving number 10 on his way to Buckingham Palace in very, very different circumstances indeed. And I think what we're going to find out over the next few weeks is exactly what this idea of one nation Toryism is. We've heard a lot of discussion about it. Boris Johnson has mentioned it on several occasions. But now that the party has used its imagination, frankly, some would say, to reach out to those parts of the country that simply were not in the conservative blue camp, some for many, many decades, to use that imagination to reach out and to form this broad consensus of where perhaps this country should be going in the next few years is really quite remarkable. We heard a lot in the past, actually, about so-called red Toryism, this idea that you can have a concept of pro-business, relatively low taxes, but also a sense that public services, the National Health Service and so on, very important to our way of life. The idea that you can combine all those in a philosophy that actually means you govern not just a section of the country, but the majority of it. Perhaps we're going to see over the tenure of Boris Johnson coming up, all this made flesh. With me is our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, as well. We're crouching down on the floor here so that the cameras can get a good view of Boris Johnson. I know, and I'm feeling it in my right leg as well. But having said all that, this is the moment that Boris Johnson has savoured, wanted to experience for such a long time. His own mandate, not just given to him by the rank and file of the Tory party, but his own mandate to run this country.
Yeah, no, I think this is a very personal triumph for Boris Johnson. I think it's hard to think the Tory party under any other leader would have achieved this sort of huge, massive majority. I think, yes, of course, Brexit was a factor, but I think too, his sort of populist brand of Torydom actually cut through in traditional Labour seats more so than Mr Corbyn's rather downcast, austere, metropolitan Labour view. And I think people actually warmed to Boris Johnson a bit. He put a smile on their faces. He gave them a sense of optimism, hope, even had a laugh. And that matters. People want to see the sunlight. So I think this was very much Boris Johnson's victory, and now, bluntly, he is master and commander of all he surveys. He has total control over the Tory party, because all those people elected, most of them I suspect wouldn't have been elected were it not for him. So this is his party. He can do what he wants, which is why this is a fascinating moment. Who is the real Boris Johnson? And in terms of Brexit, you know, he's freed from the hardline ERG.
All right, OK, we're going to leave it there as we await Boris Johnson to make that journey, short journey, to the palace to formally ask the Queen to form the next government. Emily, back to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Clive. Yes, all eyes fixed on the car before that trip begins. But let's speak now to Michael Fallon, the former Conservative Defence Secretary, and also to Anne McElvoy, the economist. And I always think there's a moment where we feel we've been through whatever political earthquake, whirlwind, you know, nobody's had any sleep, it's all done on caffeine. And then there is something so extraordinary about the idea that the monarch will have done this 13 times before. So there is almost nothing new under the sun for her at this point. She will be receiving a Prime Minister that she's already met, from Winston Churchill now to Boris Johnson, a man who obviously likes to compare himself favourably with his hero. But there is a sort of pause, isn't there, with the palace, where you suddenly realise that this is a sort of, you know, part of the sort of the national history rather than the political flurry?
Well, first, I think there'll be relief that the Queen is not going to be surprised by a new face. She'll be dealing with the same Prime Minister. And then probably relief that there isn't going to be another election for quite some time now. There is a government now with a strong majority, able now to govern for the next 4 or 5 years. And, you know, we're getting out of this rhythm now of having an election every couple of years. We've solved that logjam problem. And I think that'll be a relief to the palace as much as to anybody, all the rest of us.
We never know, do we, what the Queen thinks of her Prime Ministers, or maybe not till much later.
Perhaps till a bit later. I would say I think we get an inkling. She's obviously extremely discreet, and Prime Ministers I think have pretty sternly told that they should also maintain that, as are those around them. But I would be very surprised, given some of the indications of the last half year or so, if the message, apart from congratulations, sit down, have a nice cup of tea from some bone china in the palace, which all Prime Ministers of whatever political colour do relish that moment. It's a life-defining moment for them. I think the message will be the country needs to be brought back together again. Now that can't be done in entirety. Elections are also about preferences. They're about one side winning. They're about one prospectus emerging over another. But I do think that there is a feeling, which as far as we know, but there are sort of glimmers that there's concern about that from the Queen and from the palace, and that will be one of the things I think a bit on Boris Johnson's to-do list and the tone that he's going to strike. We move today from the election mode to governing mode, and this really, I mean, we're right on air now. This, I think, is the hinge of it, is that moment when you leave behind all the hoopla and you go to the palace and you're in for the next few years.
Expecting Boris Johnson to leave Downing Street within the next 5 minutes. The Queen may be able to do something very few of us have succeeded in doing this campaign, which is asking him direct questions. What happens next? Do you think that she will want a sense of timetable or a sense of his project now?
Well, I think you've had some idea of the project, that he is going to complete Brexit. He is going to start investing again as the age of austerity ends, spending more money, particularly on some of those northern towns that have been felt neglected since the Brexit result. So I think you see the bare bones of the government's approach. But above all, I think she'll be looking for a long-term programme, and that's what a majority of this size gives you, just as it gave Margaret Thatcher in the 80s.
Is there small talk? I guess none
of
us know.
Well, last time I went in with the Queen and the Prime Minister, you know, they chatted away. I think there's a bit of small talk, isn't it? It's when we often see a bit in memoirs that the veil is lifted a little bit. I think she's probably quite good at letting the mood come through. We know that over time, when there have been tensions, we knew that when Mrs. Thatcher, when she was Prime Minister, had some tensions with the Queen, and it tended, I think, to be more around the mood rather than the Queen saying, "Look, I don't like the miners' strike," or something like that, which I'm not saying she did say, but we know that she had some worries, for instance, about some aspects of foreign policy. I think she lets it be known, as only the Queen can.
Let's just go to our colleagues. Joanna Gosling is at Buckingham Palace. They're waiting the arrival at the other end, and Nick Witchell, our royal correspondent, is by her side. Joanna.
Emily, thank you. Yes, an air of expectation here. There's a large crowd gathered, and it's actually, strangely, very quiet. Normally around this time, the changing of the guard would be about to happen, which probably explains the majority of the crowd here. Tourists expecting to see that, but there's no movement on that front because, as we know, the Prime Minister is going to shortly be coming to the palace to see the Queen for that private audience when she will formally ask him to form the next government. Nick Witchell is here with me. This is earlier, possibly, Nick, than we would have expected. Previously, it's been done a bit later than this, isn't it?
Well, there was uncertainty, of course, last time, but on this occasion I think the Queen will be keen to get off to Windsor. I'm sure Boris Johnson is keen to just rest, and they must be exhausted. But yes, quiet here, as you say, apart from the helicopters buzzing overhead. So nearly 5 months after he came to be invited by the Queen to form his first government, become, as Emily was just saying, the 14th Prime Minister of her reign, he will be returning within the next few minutes to be invited to form a new government. Now, what of course the Palace dreads really is an indistinct outcome to the election with no clear winner. Not the case on this occasion. A resounding success for the Conservatives. There is no doubt who it is will command the confidence of the House of Commons, and so it will be Boris Johnson who the Queen will invite to form the new government.
So how long is the conversation likely to be, and is she likely to be quite probing and questioning him, do you think?
I sense it may well be quite a short audience because he's been up all night. Her concern, I would imagine, will be to ask him, well, how will you bring the country back together again? How will you overcome the divisions of this more than usually divisive election campaign? She will be interested to hear what he has to say about that. Her concern also, of course, will be to protect the Union. Now, she is non-political, a constitutional monarch, but the outcome of this election raises questions about the Union, and we do know that that is a concern of hers. She was crowned, she's often called Queen of England. She's not Queen of England. There is no such role. It was done away with 300 years ago with the Union of the Crowns. She is Queen of the United Kingdom, head of state. She is concerned about the Union, and I'm sure that that will feature in their conversation.
Controversially, of course, David Cameron breached the confidence when he spoke after the result of the Scottish referendum, when he told her the outcome and famously said she purred down the phone when he told her what the result was.
Yes, and I'm sure Boris Johnson will be very careful about that. I mean, he nearly made a mistake about that on an earlier occasion, but yeah, it is a very private conversation.
OK, well, the police are lined up here. The Queen is in the palace awaiting the arrival of Boris Johnson, and he is due here shortly. For now, back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Joanna. I wonder what defines the timing. I'm sure nobody keeps the Queen waiting. So is it about her logistics then, or is it sort of, last minute cutting of hair and
there was famously an election back in 1970 when Edward Heath won, when people weren't expecting it to, when it was Ascot week and the Queen was at Ascot, and Heath, having won the election, had to kick his heels until after tea until the Queen had returned.
If anyone could be late, it would be Boris Johnson, wouldn't it? But it does appear that on this occasion he tends
sort of a new suit, or the ironing's done.
It is a new dawn, is it not, as someone once said. Yeah.
And it's interesting to know, Nicholas Witcher was just talking about the kind of issues that will come up, not just Brexit, but presumably for the head of state of the United Kingdom, how she looks at this result in Scotland and the huge gains for the SNP, which would appear to put Scottish independence back on the table at some stage. That will be an uncomfortable conversation for the Prime Minister, won't it?
Yes, it's easy to forget that she is Queen of Scotland as well,
yeah,
as of the United Kingdom as well as of England. So obviously the Prime Minister will be wanting to reassure her that, as we move into the next stage of the Brexit process, which is the trade negotiations, that obviously Scotland's interests are going to be properly protected. But Scotland is part of the United Kingdom. It's the United Kingdom that's leaving the European Union as a whole, and therefore Scotland will have to come along with the rest of us. And the same is true in Northern Ireland. There are sensitivities there that the government will have to be careful about, particularly as Northern Ireland is going to be treated slightly differently to the rest of the United Kingdom. It'll be important for the government to breathe fresh life into the Assembly, to get the Assembly up and running again, and make sure that Northern Ireland's politicians, whether they're nationalist or whether they're unionists, do feel fully involved in any differences of treatment that there are for goods flowing across the Irish Sea.
I think it's probably maybe a longer road for the SNP through to another referendum than it might appear when you see that big sweep of seats, and they had a fantastic night in Scotland. Can't gainsay that. But what it provides, I think, for Boris Johnson is a kind of challenge. Does he go down? We've seen what happened when New Labour felt that the rise of Scottish nationalism. They went the route of devolution. Now, you could argue that they either didn't go far enough if you're on the side that tends towards Scottish nationalism, or you could say you kind of fed the beast. And one of the things I think that Boris Johnson will be considering...
Don't give them an inch, because they'll take a mile.
Do you give them an inch and say, look, at some point another referendum, or indeed more devolution, which might be another way of dealing with it? There's an interesting point here, which I'm sure that the Queen will be very well aware of, as the constitutional monarch, very sensitive, I think, on the Scottish question, by the way. I have heard that she does raise it quite a lot, is that the European Union is not very keen on secessionist movements at the moment. It's had Catalonia, which is obviously found to be something of a risk to the the idea of the EU and to the cohesion.
A risk enough to jail the perpetrators.
Indeed. So this is a much more complicated question whether there's a route through. But Boris Johnson will have to have a plan for Scotland. I don't think he could simply busk it. That's a little bit brought David Cameron too close to the brink of losing Scotland. And I think he would say himself he was a little scared by how close it got the last time.
We think we've got very good at reading the tiniest of signals from the monarch, don't we? David Cameron talking about the quarter of an inch of a raised eyebrow over the last Scottish independence referendum, or whether people interpreted her clothes, her blue and yellow hat one time as meaning that she was sort of anti-Brexit or pro-EU. She must probably have a good giggle at all the sort of inanities that come out of her gesture, unless you think that that is the only way that she can actually communicate.
It shows you how careful she's been over so many years to not get caught up in political controversy and, you know, confine herself to the pure role of being a constitutional monarch, which is in private to warn and to advise and to support, but to do so always in private.
And the royal family itself in transition. I mean, we are getting towards the end of the Queen's reign, just in terms of the actuarial calculations. There's a lot going on around the royal family that they would not welcome, as you well know, Emily, having been deeply involved in it yourself with the Prince Andrew interview. So there is quite a lot of sort of churn and concern there, and at the same time the country is, I think, a bit shell-shocked. Some people were very pleasantly surprised by the results overnight, and others will be absolutely horrified. So you have both the politics and the monarchy at the same time in ferment. Good for journalists and a bit worrying for a lot of people.
Absolutely and utterly bewildered by the idea that anyone in this country would be unhappy with a Conservative majority.
We've been crying out for a stable government to get us through this hung parliament where nothing was able to be done. We've now got a strong government. That's good news for Britain. It's good news for our allies. It's actually good news for Brussels. They'll have somebody to negotiate with who's got a working majority. They can get on and get this legal process sorted, and we can get on and sign the trade agreement that we need.
Now, we are understanding that this could be to do with the changing of the guard. So it wasn't the delay, it wasn't that Boris Johnson needed a haircut, and it certainly wasn't that the Queen herself was dallying. But bizarrely, on one of my sort of preparatory trips to the palace, we ended up coming out just at the same time as the changing of the guard. So we couldn't use the gates at the front and had to scuttle beneath the... Here we go.
There he goes.
Sajid Javid, the Chancellor, Boris Johnson jumping into... Sorry, that was not Sajid Javid. It was a very quick look at that. Sorry, it was...
Take the chance.
Yeah, protection officer. Sorry, it was a quick glance at a very tiny screen on my part. I do apologise. Boris Johnson heading off in the Jaguar then. And Clive Murray, I think, is still there watching the car depart. Clive.
Yeah, it's... yeah, hi, Emily. As you see, it's just pulled off. Just a quick wave from Boris Johnson on his way to that meeting with the Queen. Speculation, I think you were having, Emily, that he may have cut his hair for his special meeting. No. It was as ruffled and messy as ever, but he's clearly a very happy man to be heading off at the beginning of what could well be 5 years of his rule. And one expects a Queen's speech at some point in the next few weeks. There's no question about that. And he's also made it clear that he would like to bring back as soon as possible his withdrawal bill, to put it before Parliament, get that done and dusted. In the time-honoured phrase, get Brexit done, or at least certainly get the first phase of Brexit done in terms of the United Kingdom officially leaving the European Union by the end of January. So the Prime Minister on his way to meet the Queen.
This is a journey that, thanks Clive, that can miraculously make it look as if there is no traffic ever in London. The trip can last a mere 4 minutes on a day like today and give you a totally unreal sense of the city that we live in, or that you do get the sense of the digger in the middle. Through Admiralty Arch, they are driving down the Mall, and We are following that convoy around the very top of the Mall there. And this is the scene of the Troopy of the Colour, Queen's official birthday. You might remember last time this happened, we believe it was it Extinction Rebellion that were barring the route to the palace, and they actually jumped out and stopped the convoy for a few moments. Joanna Gosling is waiting for the arrival at the other end. Joanna.
Yes, Emily, as you say, it's just a matter of minutes for that car to bring Boris Johnson from Downing Street here to Buckingham Palace, and the road is cleared to ensure a very smooth drive for him as he heads here. And in the past minutes since we were last speaking to you, the changing of the guard has happened. We wondered whether it might have been changed to accommodate the arrival of Boris Johnson, but it has all happened. The band struck up, the guard has changed, and there remains a large crowd here as we wait the arrival of Boris Johnson. He will be ushered into the private room to meet the Queen, something that will of course be familiar to him as he is a returning Prime Minister and he's been having those weekly audiences with the Queen, and so he will be ushered into that room, and the process will be, and just behind me actually we can see now the police outriders coming in, followed by the Prime Minister's car. So they would come through the gates of Buckingham Palace, and he will be greeted by the Queen's equerry to be taken up to meet Her Majesty, and that is the point at which she will formally ask him to form the next government. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell with me. The second time he's done this, Nick.
Yes, in through the gates. You notice how many police there were along the Mall to prevent any repetition of the climate protesters on the last occasion in July. Through the Central Arch into the quadrangle, escorted by the special escort group of the Metropolitan Police. The motorcyclists buzzing around. They've now withdrawn, and in a moment we'll see the Jaguar sweep round to the King's Door, as it's called, and he will be out and up to the Queen's audience room. 5 months, as we were saying earlier, or very nearly 5 months since he made this same journey to be invited to form his first government. Now the resounding winner of the general election of December 2019. He arrives at Buckingham Palace, drawing up at the door there, and he will be in for what I would imagine would be a fairly short audience with the Queen, who has remained in London rather than going to Windsor in order to see the Prime Minister. There he is, greeted by the equerry and Edward Young, the Queen's private secretary, who will escort him. Mr. Johnson, of course, not with his partner, Carrie Symonds. And in they go up to the audience room and a conversation with the Queen.
And we can start the clock ticking, I guess, fairly soon to see how long it's likely to be. What's the general range of these conversations?
Well, they can be between 20 and 40 minutes, as Emily was saying. I remember Gordon Brown was in there for a very long time, but I think on this occasion I would expect it would be fairly short, but you can never tell.
Okay, well we'll stay here, see what happens, and keep you updated, of course, here from Buckingham Palace. But for now, back to you, Emily.
Joanna, thanks very much indeed. There is something remarkable, isn't there? I should just say, if you've joined us, we're with Michael Fallon, Anne McElvoy and Michael Cockrell, who of course has documentaried and know many of the last Prime Ministers. But there is something remarkable about the fact that in this very hyper-digital age, the two of them will go into a room and no one will know exactly what is said there. There is no note-taking, there is no documentation at all, and we assume complete privacy on the part of both.
Absolutely. Well, there wasn't quite complete confidentiality when Boris Johnson first went to see the Queen, and his aides leaked what she had said to him. But I think he's learned his lesson from that. But it is remarkable, isn't it? When you think of it, her first Conservative Prime Minister, following her first Conservative Prime Minister was old Harrovian Winston Churchill, and she's been there through all the rest of them. And 4 or 5 of the last Conservative prime ministers have been brought down, or more or less brought down, by Europe. And Boris is the first one who's benefited from Europe.
Yes, which poses such a big question of whether Europe and the Conservatives are now a battle that's sort of fought and won, or at least fought and over. But back to this audience, what is your sense from all that you've documented, Michael, of the nature of the questions? Are they subtly asked? Are they direct? Are they uncompromising?
I think Her Majesty goes in for a Socratic dialogues. She doesn't actually ask a question as such, but she suggests what she wants to hear from the way she talks to her Prime Minister, and they come up with things. And they, of course, I mean, Tony Blair said the only person you can really trust apart from your wife is the Queen, because she's the only one who A, won't leak, and B, doesn't want my job.
So is there a sense then that when the two are in conversation that he needs to provide her with answers, or will he just sort of allow the day to sink in?
He needs to provide her with answers. I think he can. He's been saying what he's going to do for so long. He can give that spiel, which she will have already heard quite often.
That spiel is Her Majesty almost certainly doesn't call it. Yeah. And I think there's some truth in that. I think probably he lays out what he would like to do. My guess is that this question of the country, if you see what has happened there, there's expectations across the north of England. Michael Fallon, I was saying earlier, Michael's time as an MP up in Darlington, the northeast, the northwest, that sense of the blue breakthrough, that there are lots of hopes associated with that in some parts of the country. Not all of the north, northeast or northwest is poor, but there is a sense that for a lot of these communities, and I think the Queen has always had great concern for, and certainly Prince Charles has, because the Prince's Trust has been very active in those parts of the country. What is he really going to do about that? I think the expectations are pretty high, and that Boris Johnson and this new wave of MPs, many of them from northern regions, and much more so than Conservatives I've been covering for the past 20 years, how is that going to change?
Anne McElvoy, thanks very much indeed. Stay with us. Good morning. If you've just joined us on BBC One, on BBC News Channel, or from around the globe, this is a seminal moment in the election of the UK's new Prime Minister, where he arrives at Buckingham Palace for his appointment with the Queen. The monarch will ask if he is able to form the next government, and she has seen 13 prime ministers in her reign, and up till this point no one has yet said no. Let me introduce our guests on the panel, Michael Cockrell, Michael Fallon and Anne McElvoy. Michael, let me come to you. Fallon first, as it were. A sense that the Queen, we hear, is often a very soothing presence at this time, that if you come with all the jitters of expectation and of an incredibly difficult night, as the one we saw under Theresa May 2 years ago, then she can be quite a reassuring presence at this point.
Yes, it's an important moment constitutionally. The Prime Minister has to get the authority of the Queen to form a government, and some reassurance that there's a programme for the government, and that there are going to be a relatively stable pattern. We shouldn't perhaps forget that the Queen's had to open Parliament already this year. She opened it in October. Now she's going back to open it again next week. And I'm sure that Boris will be able to reassure her that he has now put together a programme for the whole of the Parliament for a 4 or 5 year stretch, which will give the country more stability.
Everything is happening much more quickly this time than last because of that secure majority, because of the speed at which the results have come in. I know we can go to David Lidington, who can join us down the line, the former Conservative Deputy Prime Minister who's in Belfast now. And David Lidington, I wonder if you're recalling 2 years ago a very different set of circumstances for your Prime Minister Theresa May there, where it all happened in much more confused terms, very nebulous sense of what the government would be, how it would be formed, and yet she still had to make that trip to the Prime Minister.
Yes, that's right. And I think that that openings of difficulty that Theresa had with a hung Parliament, in a sense, indicated some of the difficulties that going to beset any Prime Minister and beset her if you don't have a majority, and the head of government, the PM, is having to spend so much time negotiating with half a dozen MPs here, half a dozen MPs there to get any piece of legislation through. And I think what's so good about last night's result is that there is clarity, that there is a clear majority, that Boris Johnson has a mandate that he can lead the country and the government on for 5 years, for a full Parliament, if that is what he chooses to do, and then be judged by the electorate at the end of that full term.
I'm wondering how you're feeling this morning. There were plenty of you, your colleagues from the last cabinet, who chose to step down, not to fight this general election. You thought that Boris Johnson was a different sort of Conservative beast. Do you have any regrets about that this morning?
No. I mean, my reasons for stepping aside were personal ones. I've been in Parliament for 27 years, and I didn't want to commit myself to a further full 5-year term. I don't resile from that at all. No, I've had some areas where I've disagreed with Boris Johnson, the way I've disagreed with at times with all of the other 7 party leaders there have been since I first joined the Tory party more than 40 years ago. But I'm delighted that there is an overall Conservative majority, and he deserves credit as the PM for the fact that, when a lot of us, including me, doubted that we could ever win seats in places like Blythe Valley and Sedgefield and Lee and Lancashire, that he trusted his instincts and the polling results he was getting privately, and he's won through with a very effective campaign. And I think what he's done is banish the risk that the extreme left-wing views and ideas represented by Mr Corbyn and Mr McDonnell would be allowed to wreak havoc with our economy and our security, which, if they'd got a handle on power, I fear would have been the case. And then, we can also now move forward with delivering the referendum result. I've always taken the view the 2016 referendum did not go the way I wanted, but I said at the time I'd accept the people's verdict, and I've tried always to stick to that, and, we have to follow that through.
It was curious, wasn't it, though? First thing this morning, we heard Boris Johnson talk about one nation conservatism. Yeah. And when you look at the people who have, who have left, Amber Rudd, Philip Hammond, yourself, Nicky Morgan, do you not regret that you've lost many of those colleagues who would all have called themselves one nation Conservatives, and they're on the outside of the party now?
Well, hang on. I mean, I'm certainly not outside the party. I've been actively campaigning for Conservative candidates, as has Nicky Morgan, as have most of those others you've mentioned. And amongst the new Conservative intake and amongst those who've been re-elected, there are men and women who will very proudly describe themselves as one nation Conservatives. And I very much welcome the fact that the Prime Minister has used again today that phrase and saying he wants to lead a one nation government. He wants to bring people back together, heal the differences that have grown up in this country in the past few years. And that's going to be particularly important because the Conservative Parliamentary Party now is going to represent seats that are more working class, are poorer, feel more left behind than the seats that we have represented in most recent parliaments. And those new Conservative MPs for those former Labour bastions in the North and Midlands are going to want to keep their seats, and they're going to want to represent the interests and the views of the people who've trusted them, who've led their votes this time. What I've heard today from the PM and from Michael Gove is that we want to turn that loan of votes yesterday into a permanent longer-term commitment to supporting the Conservative Party, and that's why I think you'll see a Johnson government now really focusing on things like infrastructure to improve road and rail links between northern cities, on apprenticeships, on better technical education, on grabbing the opportunities that some of the new technologies, life sciences, GM, nanotechnology, offer us, and to try to overcome the problems of lack of competitiveness that have held the United Kingdom back under successive governments for too long now.
David Liddington, thanks for joining us. We will get back to that meeting with the Queen, which promises to be slightly different this time round. I'm sure we've got statisticians working on it in the background somewhere, but the length of time between the last visit for an audience with the Queen of this kind and this one has been incredibly short, just 5 months. And as a result of that, we understand that he won't do the formal photograph and may not make the speech. I wonder if there is a sense then of, does he go in with this
when you say make the speech, he will make a speech when he comes back to
Street, but he won't make a statement outside there. But will he?
Normally
they
do
would
well.
never never say anything.
They go straight back
but they'd
into
have
the car.
a photo. Is that the normal
Yes,
thing?
there's a photo as he kisses hands and so on.
Well, what we're hearing is that he might not make that speech this time round in Downing Street. He might choose to leave it a little later and maybe head to the northeast. I guess we have the day ahead of us to find that out. But one of the questions that this raises, Michael Fallon now, is whether this is about continuity or whether this is a brand new start. How do you think Boris Johnson is viewing this? Because he certainly painted it as a sort of a new dawn, rather like the Tony Blair 97 moment.
Well, the Parliamentary Party will certainly be different. Some of the arch Remainers, of course, have left. Others stood as independents and were defeated. So he has a much more united party than any of his predecessors, going all the way back to John Major. And all of them have signed up to the policy that we are leaving Brexit by the end of January. So he won't have some of the difficulties of party management that Theresa May had, for example, in dealing with the European Research Group and all the rest of it. He won't have those difficulties. He will have a lot of new blood, these new MPs, who will certainly want to keep to a one-nation policy and will be looking for additional investment in their areas. They will be asking where the new hospital is, when the new railway is coming. They will be looking to see that their region, is not going to be left behind any longer.
And might be the first Conservative Prime Minister not to be brought down by Europe.
Yes, or at least not in short order. Remember, he still has to get through a very difficult trade deal, and he set himself very hard deadlines on that, and he sometimes seems to kind of suggest both a hard and soft Brexit at once, a kind of scrambled Brexit, and that will not be easy to deliver. He will have to choose, and particularly with a majority of this size, he can't say, well, my hands are tied. Something else about the Conservative Party and the changes in it, Emily. A lot of people worried maybe that there was a kind of more populist edge to this, but it's certainly true that the parts of the country where Boris Johnson has won this victory expect spending. They expect what you might call one-nation Toryism. They expect the South to reach out to them. They don't really so much expect Boris Johnson's Singapore-on-Thames, as it was put, his ultra free market caricature. Again, he will have to choose. He's been very good up to now, having it both ways and often fudging some things while keeping moving forward. I think the moment of choice is now quite close for him, and that this is the winged victory. It propels him, but it also means that he has to be very clear what his direction is going to be.
A lot's happening quite quickly this morning. We're already on this visit to Her Majesty the Queen. But if you've just joined us and you want to get a sense of what actually happened overnight, let's just bring you up to date with some of the results here at Westminster. The Conservatives then taking control of the House of Commons after an overwhelming win in the general election. They now have a majority of 78. There is just one seat still to declare, St Ives in Cornwall, which was delayed by high winds, the boats that had to bring back the ballot boxes from the Scilly Isles. Boris Johnson is right now at the palace asking the Queen for permission to form a government. And Jeremy Corbyn has said this evening it was a very disappointing night. The Liberal Democrats had a bad night too. Their party leader, Jo Swinson, lost her seat and she quit. The SNP did well, coming close to sweeping the board in Scotland. So we'll just take a look at all those results as they stand while we wait for the Prime Minister to emerge. The Conservatives then on 364 seats, that's gains of 47. Labour on 203, they are down 59 seats overnight. The SNP have 48 MPs, they increased their tally by 13. The Liberal Democrats now only have 11, down 1. One of them being, of course, Jo Swinson, the leader herself. The DUP are on 8 now, they've lost 2. And Sinn Féin, who don't take their seats in Westminster, are on 7. You can also look, though, at the vote share, because this is where you suddenly realise the difference that a proportional system would give us in understanding how the vote is shared out. The Conservatives gained 45%, but as a share of the vote, extraordinary to see, that's just an increase of 1. The Labour vote is on 33%, that's down 8. A bad night for Labour, as we've said. The Lib Dems have increased their share of the vote, and that's something that they are keen to spread the word on. Even though they are down 1 MP, they, under this system, don't naturally fare well. The SNP are 4%, they're up 1, even though they've taken that huge swathe. It's all been in the One Nation of Scotland, of course. Greens on 3%, they're up 1. And the Brexit Party on 2% share, but they don't bring any MPs into the Commons on that. We will be bringing you the reaction, speaking, as you can see, to all the main parties and looking at what the result means for Westminster and for Brexit as you stay with us throughout the day. Right now, let's go to Joanna Gosling, who's at Buckingham Palace for us, where the Prime Minister is having his audience with Her Majesty the Queen.
Yes, we think he's been in there, about 18 minutes now, and the car is waiting outside whenever he emerges. The process of the changing of the guards continues, so even if he wanted to leave right now, I don't think he could, because there's all of that happening here. You can see there the car which he will come out to whenever he does leave, but about 18 minutes or so now, and Nick was saying earlier that the average audience probably around about this time, up to maybe even 40 minutes. But the expectation is that it won't be very long, because he's keen to send the message that he wants to get on with the business of government, get Brexit done. Speculation a bit around when the Queen's speech will be. Initially it was thought it may have been next Thursday, but it's now looking like it may not now be until after Christmas. So, Nick, he's in there with the Queen. Is she going to be asking him direct questions, do you think?
Well, I think she would, yeah. I mean, she can be very direct in her questioning. She will be very curious. She's very astute politically. She's very curious, as we all are at the moment, as to what is going to be his strategy. And she will be concerned, as we were saying earlier, about bringing the country back together again, what his plans for that will be, and, as we were saying, about the Union, because there are very particular challenges now as a result of the election result in Scotland, the SNP strengthening its position there, and she is concerned about that in a completely non-political way, but she will want to have reassurance about that from him. So this entirely private conversation, which nearly 20 minutes in length now, I wouldn't imagine that it would be very much longer, but as you say, there is this slight complication of changing the guard taking place. Interestingly, for those who are curious about these sorts of things, it's actually the Navy which is forming the new guard, which is why some people may have spotted that it is the band of Her Majesty's Royal Marines, which is in the forecourt of Buckingham Palace there, taking over from the Foot Guards for a few days. Quite unusual for the Royal Navy actually to form the guard here. Anyway, that's not something that Boris Johnson will be concerned about, though it is perhaps just delaying his departure for a few moments. But there we can see the car still stationary at the King's door through that central archway, but I wouldn't imagine that it would be too much longer. There's the old guard, the Foot Guards, and there you can see a Royal Navy person going into the sentry box to form the new guard, just to sort of throw that in.
And Nick, on the business of the timing of the Queen's speech, it was thought it could possibly be next Thursday. It's now thought not likely till after Christmas. Would the Queen actually have much of a say in it? Because obviously we're getting near to Christmas. She's got plans. She wants to get off.
She will do whatever the government requests her to do. She would wish to go to Sandringham to begin the Christmas break. I sense, in a way, she might have preferred to do it before going to Sandringham, because if it's in the new year, as it would appear that is going to be the case, she will have to come back from Sandringham and break her Christmas break. She wouldn't normally return to London from Sandringham until early February. So, but she is a dutiful constitutional monarch. She will do whatever is necessary. But right now, I would imagine that she's quite keen to conclude the conversation with the Prime Minister and get off to Windsor, because she's delayed her departure where she normally spends the weekend in order, of course, to see the outcome of the election.
And they will have had some time to get to know each other over the last 5 months since he's been Prime Minister, with private audiences and other official state business. He's her 14th Prime Minister. Is it possible to get a measure of the dynamic of their relationship at this stage?
I don't think it is. She is sufficiently experienced at this never to give any inkling as to what she thinks of any of her prime ministers. I think she will have got to know him quite well, because he has gone up to Balmoral, of course, with his partner Carrie Symonds in September for the prime ministerial weekend at Balmoral, and there have been the weekly audiences. They will have been interrupted to some extent by the election campaign, as is normally the case, but having had 13 previous prime ministers, this is one monarch who is pretty experienced at reading the personality of the person who is sitting in that audience room, in the entirely confidential circumstances of that. And she has developed, after 60 plus years on the throne, a pretty acute set of political antennae.
Joining us here at Buckingham Palace, also Dr. Anna Whitelock, royal historian. Anna, talk us through the official side of what is happening today, because they're having obviously a conversation which has now gone on for more than 20 minutes, but in terms of the actual formalities, what is it?
Well, of course, Boris Johnson secured that landmark Commons majority, but officially he's not Prime Minister until the Queen invites him to do so as the largest party in the Commons. And they're going through a process known as the kissing of hands. He would have been invited this morning to Buckingham Palace for the kissing of the hands, which is an old ceremony. The kissing does not happen anymore, but it's simply the Queen.
Just explain what the kissing was then. When
it was a mark of loyalty and duty to the sovereign from the Prime Minister, but now this is just a reference point really to that formal invitation for Boris Johnson to become her Prime Minister. I think Nick talked about direct questions that the Queen is likely to be asking. Boris Johnson himself has talked about difficult questions. He talked, of course, on his way to his audience with the Queen to dissolve Parliament before the election. He actually made a video in his car on the way here, which raised eyebrows among some people, talking about, gosh, this was going to be difficult. She always asked difficult questions, and not least, he said at that time, why on earth he was calling an election. One wonders if he will be doing a similar video on the way back. Of course, when he was first installed as Prime Minister, he also said that the Queen had asked him, I don't know why anyone would want this job. So although the Queen will be delighted, no doubt, that there's not an inconclusive end to the election, I think she'll be hoping that he's not indiscreet about the meeting that they're having, and he will do as he should, which of course is not to reveal anything about his audience. It's also, of course, important to remember that the constitutional function of the monarch is to advise and to warn, and I think actually the Queen will be taking those particular words and that particular responsibility very seriously. She will be advising him perhaps on the need for unity to try and heal the division in the country, and will warn him perhaps about some of the rhetoric, some of the language that of course has been used in politics. I think she'll probably be expressing her concern about that. She's already made remarks suggesting unease about the Brexit tensions in the country, and of course, as Nick says quite rightly, she will be very fearful about what might happen to the Union, and will no doubt be warning him about that too. So I think we can imagine that Boris Johnson will actually be listening to the Queen. She's a wise woman. She's seen pretty much everything before, although perhaps not what she's been witnessed over the last few months. And I think he'll be doing well to heed her warning and heed her advice.
I mean, diplomatic language, obviously, she is, when you say she is giving advice, but on issues that she as you say, cares about a great deal, and it will be in the gift of the Prime Minister to decide whether or not to allow another independence referendum in Scotland. Would you expect her to be quite robust on that?
I think I mean, we don't know, of course, what happens in these audiences. I think she's a very measured in her words. She doesn't ever want to overstep the mark in terms of her constitutional function. By all accounts, certainly as you mentioned, David Cameron's comment after he revealed the result of the referendum, she was delighted that last time the Scots didn't vote for independence. I think there's no doubt that the Queen would not be happy with a breakup of the Union, but I'm sure she's not going to be making overt statements to the new Prime Minister. She will be respectfully advising, respectfully warning, and I think he will be respectfully listening to her advice. She's a woman who's been there, done that. Of course, her first Prime Minister was Winston Churchill, Boris Johnson's great hero, and I'm sure as he made his way here today, he will be reflecting on that. He returns as her 14th Prime Minister, and her first being Winston Churchill.
27 minutes inside the palace now with the Queen, Nick.
27 minutes, yeah. Well, they're finding more to talk about. It's either that or the fact that the changing the guard is still taking place outside. But I think that any comments that the Queen would make would be very elliptical. The meaning may be quite clear, but she's extremely cautious and careful. But as we've said, she has the right to be consulted, to encourage and to warn. That is the role of the constitutional monarch within our system.
And just going back over that history that you were talking about there, Anna, with the number of prime ministers who have served during her time on the throne. And I'm sorry, I think I now need to hand you back to the studio.
Joanna, thank you very much. We were enjoying it nonetheless. But we have some latest reaction to the election result overnight. First and foremost, we'll bring you the words of the former Conservative Prime Minister, David Cameron, who spoke on camera just a few moments ago. Let's have a listen.
Well, first of all, big congratulations to Boris Johnson and all those Conservative candidates who work so hard. It's an extraordinary result, a powerful result. It marks the end of Corbyn and Corbynism, and that's a very good thing for the country. But more to the point, it gives us a very strong and decisive government and the opportunity to build the dynamic economy and the good public services that we need in Britain. And that's the most important thing of all, winning the trust of people that have put their trust in us, many of them for the first time. And Boris will have my full support as he does that.
David Cameron there. Let's return to our panel. Michael Fallon, Anne McElvoy and Michael Cockrell. Let me start with you, Michael Fallon. I'm imagining, just looking at David Cameron there must be a slight sense of relief because so much was on his shoulders up until this stage. What had happened to the Conservative Party, what had happened to the country, what had happened to the level of discourse was rather being aimed at his decisions over the referendum.
I think it'll be relief all round, actually, that we do now have a united party. We're all focused on that objective of getting out of the European Union, getting on with the trade agreement, and starting to invest again in our public services and infrastructure, particularly in the north. So I think there will be relief all the way round. Now, obviously, the referendum was divisive. Of course it was. It divided everybody. It divided families. It was a binary choice. You know, that's to be expected. But I think now this result starts to put the referendum behind us. And you've seen the defeat of the Liberal Democrats who wanted to put another referendum in front of us, and Labour who couldn't make up their mind. The referendum now, I think this morning, really is behind us.
Do you agree with that, Michael? It's quite interesting that this is the first time that we've broadcast from Westminster where there hasn't been extraordinary crowds and shouting in the megaphones. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that means the entire nation is now united in one voice. But do you think the mood has changed?
No, I think the mood has changed dramatically, partly because Corbyn will now have gone, you know, de-Corbyned by Christmas, but also I think that you have to be careful with a large majority. Remember in the 1983 election, the then chief whip.
Just going to hold you there, the Prime Minister now coming out of the palace, the door open for him, expecting him being seen off by what we believe is the Queen's private secretary or her query, is that right?
Yes, I'm the Queen's private secretary.
And it's been a long audience.
Yes.
All those assumptions that they wouldn't have much to say because the last one was so little time ago, overturned by what seems to have been over half an hour, maybe even 40 minutes.
Interesting. Of course, Boris has form with the Queen. You know, I bet the one word they didn't mention was prorogation in that he hasn't.
But no doubt she'll want to know whether she's expected to deliver a Queen's speech next week, whether that's now put back. And also, Anne, you were talking about the sense of what this moment does for the UK on the world stage once again. People may not understand our politics, few of us do at the moment, but they do understand the role of the monarchy in British life, don't they?
Well, I'm channeling a headline from the Bild Zeitung a little while back in Germany, the big mass circulation tabloid in Germany, which had a great headline, "You Crazy Brits." And I think it summarised the way that a lot of the establishment, the media, and certainly the Brussels establishment, and a lot of mainstream European leaders saw Britain and the referendum. And in some ways, you know, this is a long road out of that. Certainly a lot of people, especially Michael Fallon saying it's a settled matter, you know, a lot of people will be very unhappy today to think that the second referendum is off the table, which I also think it probably is for anything like the foreseeable future, but it's a changeable world. There's certainly big vote banks of people who will be very disappointed, and I think we'll be looking to what happens next in the Labour Party to see if there's any natural home for them. But on the international stage, I think these are the images that go around the world, which add a certain sort of anchor to Britain in that sense that the stability, even in very changeable times. And I was just interested there looking at changing of the guard, you know, which is from every child's nursery tales onwards, the changing of the guard of Buckingham Palace is a bit of a thing, isn't it? And there's sometimes that sense that in these times that have been so fractious that we rely a lot on this kind of imagery. Now, can Boris Johnson live up to it? Can he provide that stability? Not everyone is going to like it. Not everyone is going to like what he says and does. But can we get off the "you crazy Brits" naughty step in terms of Europe? That would be really interesting to observe.
The changing guards at Buckingham Palace, Boris de Pfeffel went down without Carrie. The place looked out, it wasn't the King's. He's much too busy assigning things, said Alice.
So he was on his own, wasn't he? A deliberate decision.
That is the point, obviously a deliberate decision, perhaps.
But if I can pick up on his point, I think, you know, our allies, our friends around the world, you know, will be relieved. They used to admire Britain, the way we were, you know, sensible about our constitution, the way we changed governments very peacefully and so on. This is normal service now being resumed. We're going to see a reasonably strong government with a 5-year programme getting on with the business of the Queen.
Now that's such an interesting statement, isn't it, Michael Fallon, because many will say you don't just get to resume normal service after you've misled the Queen, after you've prorogued Parliament, after you've played around with your response to the Supreme Court. Maybe normal service doesn't just resume quite so smoothly.
Well, I think we've got beyond that now. You know, we've had the election, we've had an extraordinary result, a united Conservative Party now, lining up behind Boris Johnson to get on with the Brexit as he promised, and getting behind him in his commitment to do more for other regions of the country.
I mean, that's a really important area, isn't it? Because what we've learned from this campaign is that style works. It worked on the electorate.
It got Boris Johnson where he wanted to go, and it provided the kind of prow of the ship that was able to sort of cut through, and it's brought home this result. I think to the extent we're not only changing the guard at Buckingham Palace, but changing guard in the Conservative Party in quite a radical way at this election. Some of that plays to Michael Fallon's argument that some things that happened have been put behind us, but I don't think one can entirely, I can't be boosterish, and I shouldn't be, as Michael Fallon would be. You know, this has left a sediment of bitterness. It's left a lot of people feeling politically homeless, that particularly if they're strong Remainers and moderates, whether in the Conservative tradition or in the Labour tradition. And the Liberal Democrats, who tried to channel that, didn't really get there in terms of the numbers. There's still a lot of people out there who are going to need to feel represented. I'm very interested in the tone that Boris Johnson takes towards them. He can't go to just keep tub thumping the way he did 3 months ago.
It was only 2 weeks ago, though, that he appeared in front of an audience, and when the question of trust was raised, they laughed. Now, what does that tell us about ourselves, our electorate, that we can still vote into power with a huge majority, not seen since 1987, a man who we laugh at the idea of trusting?
Well, partly because of who he was up against. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn promised he'd found the magic money tree and was promising to distribute it. Interestingly, up in the north, I was there, and a number of people, working men, said to me, "Don't like this idea of the four-day week. They're going to pay me for 4 days, so it's a wage cut of 20%. I want to work for 5 days and be paid for 5 days," and that blew up, I think, in his face.
But whatever doubts I think people had about Boris Johnson, they also at the same time feared a Corbyn government and what damage it might do to the economy and what it might do to our security.
He's getting into the car now, and he will head away from Buckingham Palace. That was the King's entrance, the central quadrangle. They come in through that main gate, possibly delayed, as we were saying, by the changing of the guards, which happens around 11ish each morning, and they are going out of the archway into the main forecourt in front of the palace. And from here, we understand it will be a trip down the Mall and back to Downing Street. And there is a weird moment where we start to hear the helicopters behind us here in the studio and see the build-up and the flash of motorbikes.
Here, isn't it?
We actually know it's happening because it will be at our doorstep very soon as the Prime Minister heads back to Downing Street, where normally we would expect a speech, but he will have these few moments alone, quiet, in the car to reflect now on what an extraordinary and remarkable moment this is for our Conservative Prime Minister.
It's also especially remarkable because many of the recent Prime Ministers who've become Prime Minister in the middle of a parliament have desperately wanted to validate themselves by having an election and winning power from the people. Mrs May wanted to do it, Gordon Brown wanted to do it, going back, Jim Callaghan wanted to do it. So he's actually been able to win power for himself. He's
and
now
interestingly, they changed the slogan,
by the people,
haven't they? So it now says the people's government. Exactly. They can hold that up as a card and say, we won right across
right
the
across the country. That said, of course, I'm old enough to remember Tony Blair going on and on about the People's Parties, and people today say, oh, this has got a populist edge. But I think every 10 years somebody says, do you know what is a good word? People.
Let's go to Clive Myrie, who is awaiting that car at the other end. Will maybe give us an update on what happens at Downing Street now. Clive.
Yeah, hi. The car, his silver Jaguar, should be arriving in the next couple of minutes or so. Yeah, where do we go from here as far as the parliamentary timetable is concerned? A lot of speculation that perhaps there'd be a Queen's speech in some truncated form, perhaps, before Christmas, possibly next Thursday. Also, the introduction of, the reintroduction, I should say, of the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement with the European Union back on the floor of the House of Commons before Christmas as well. Some of that timetable seems to have been thrown up in the air. Norman Smith, our assistant political editor, is here. What more are you hearing about the possibility of a Queen's speech next week?
Well, all the indications are it'll be on Thursday, and then, as you're saying, he'll bring his Brexit bill back, not just introducing it in the Commons on Friday, but going for the crucial crunch second reading vote, which is the big vote, because he wants to keep up momentum. He wants to keep up the sense that he's going ahead at full steam. and he wants it basically to get over its major parliamentary hurdle ahead of Christmas. I'm told there won't be any major cabinet reshuffle this side of Christmas. That is going to wait, I'm told, until after Brexit. So he will seek to get Brexit done and dusted, at least the first phase, by the end of January. And then in February there will be, if you like, a pause and then a fresh government burst with a reshuffle and the sort of non-Brexit agenda rolled out, and the second phase, if you like. So the first priority will be to get Brexit, as I say, phase one done and dusted, and then we'll learn a little bit about what Boris Johnson's real priorities are, what he decides to do next on his domestic agenda, because at the moment we only have this pretty minimalist manifesto which doesn't really tell us very much at all about what he's planning. I mean, he was deliberately stripped of any particular firm policy proposals. We will then, I think, get a much clearer sense of what it is Boris Johnson wants to do in terms of domestic politics. So a little bit of calm, I suppose, over the next hour or so. I don't think we're going to hear from Boris Johnson when he comes back in the next minute or so. I think there's not going to be a podium moment now. He'll go back in. I think we will hear more from him this afternoon, certainly before 6 o'clock. And then Parliament, of course, resumes Tuesday, we think, next week, where there'll be swearing in of MPs. And as I say, then the Queen's speech on Thursday, and then Friday, that big Brexit debate where he will have a huge majority.
Fascinating discussion as well that Emily and her panel have been having about how Boris Johnson and his new government try to bring this country together. And Nicholas Witchell also making the point that perhaps one of the questions the Queen will have asked Boris Johnson in that meeting a few minutes ago is, how are you going to bring this country back together? Of course, 48% voted to remain. Boris Johnson himself, in his remarks this morning, in his victory speech, said that he understands that there were perhaps voters who were quivering over the ballot paper before they could actually put their X next to a Conservative name. Do we have any indication, really, how he is going to move forward on that point?
I think we got a sense of that in the tone of his speech today, the very fact that it wasn't sort of gloating or anything like that, saying to those Labour voters, as you said, look, I know you've maybe lent me your votes, but I'm going to work very hard day in, day out to earn your support. And I think he knows he's got to adopt a much more all-encompassing approach.
Prime Minister walking with a bit of a spring in his step to his residence for the next 5 years. The silver Jaguar stock and short. And a huge cheer inside the entrance there of number 10. You can see the flashes of the bulbs inside, people taking photographs and so on, outside and inside clearly. A momentous moment, obviously, for him and for the Conservative Party. But going back to how he potentially is going to bring this country back together after such divisiveness over several years now.
I think his people take the view that once the first phase of Brexit is done, there will be a sort of recognition that it's over. There's no point continuing to fight this war of attrition, and the hope is that basically Remainers will accept that it's over. There's no point carrying on. They have to make the best and kind of get with the project. So that is part of their hope. But there's also got to be an attempt by him to meet some of his sort of promises about helping areas of the country which feel left behind. That too has to be a part of what he now does, putting money into those areas which, have seen their town centres depleted, who feel they've really not had any say in the decision-making process, feel ignored. Somehow he's got to engage with those people. And that does in part mean putting resources in. So when we get the Brexit budget within the first 100 days, that is going to be a huge moment too. How far can he actually give those parts of Britain who feel they've been ignored a sense that they are being listened to, that the government is, as it were, putting some effort and serious resources into revitalising, regenerating those communities. So we've been, terribly focused on Brexit for so long. There is, I think, a sort of yawning appetite for all those other issues to be tackled. And I mean, there are a vast number. I mean, one of the other ones I was thinking about is social care. You know, we've been promised this plan, and everyone knows social care is in crisis. Everyone knows. It's been like that for years. There is a huge obligation on Boris Johnson now to stand up and come out with a clear, coherent plan. It's understandable why in the election he didn't want to do that, because it was such a nightmare, as we saw with Theresa May, trying to come up with a plan that was remotely acceptable. Nevertheless, for many, many people, you know, they see the difficulties facing their parents. Yeah, it's something which everyone knows has to be tackled. So there are a whole load of unfinished business which had been put on hold for years. He is now going to have to turn his attention to, and he has the space to do it.
All right, OK, we'll leave it there. Norman, many thanks for that. So the hard work, as Norman was indicating, really begins now. But we heard the shouts and the massive, huge welcome that Boris Johnson received when he returned back from meeting the Queen, formally asking her to form the next government. His reception here, huge. So while the hard work is about to begin, I suspect a bit of a party's going on in there as well. Emily, back to you.
Clive and Norman, thank you both. You're watching BBC Election 2019. Plenty more from here in a moment, but first we're going to cross the newsroom and join Louise Minchin, who has a summary of the day's stories.
Thanks, Emily. Good morning to you. And the Conservatives have won their biggest general election majority since Margaret Thatcher in 1987, after claiming scores of seats from Labour in its traditional heartlands in the north of England. Jeremy Corbyn has said he will stand down after overseeing what he called a period of reflection within the party. Jonathan Blake has the story of the night and a warning there are flashing images in this report.
A convincing victory. Winning here in Blythe Valley and in constituencies across the UK, the Conservatives swept back into power. This morning, Boris Johnson told his supporters they had caused a political earthquake.
Well, we did it. We did it. We pulled it off, didn't we? We pulled it off. We broke the deadlock. We ended the gridlock. We smashed the roadblock.
And after turning once solid Labour seats Tory blue, he promised not to let voters down.
Your hand may have quivered over the ballot paper as before you put your cross in the Conservative box. And you may intend to return to Labour next time round. And if that is the case, I am humbled that you have put your trust in me and that you have put your trust in us.
We did it.
Overnight, new Conservative MPs were elected throughout Labour's heartlands, the losing side looking on as seat after seat fell away.
Are you going to resign, Mr Corbyn?
There's no hiding from the scale of Labour's defeat. Jeremy Corbyn says he won't fight another election as leader. His supporters blame Brexit, but there's a fight for the future of the party.
We tried our best to have a policy of principle where we bring the country back together again, both Remain and Leavers, but that obviously proved to be impossible.
You lost your seat, Miss Swinson.
Disaster for the Liberal Democrats. Their leader had lost her seat, her party and its supporters in despair.
For millions of people in our country, these results will bring dread and dismay, and people are looking for hope.
Sheer joy for the Scottish National Party, winning seats, helping the leader make her case.
I don't pretend that every single person that voted SNP yesterday will necessarily support independence, but there has been a strong endorsement in this election of Scotland having a choice over our future.
Re-elected and back in power, Boris Johnson left Downing Street this morning to meet the Queen and ask to form a new government, now with the majority and the mandate that he needed. Jonathan Blake, BBC News.
In Wales, the Conservatives recorded their best result in over 30 years, taking 14 of the 40 seats. Labour remains the largest party, but lost 6 seats. Plaid Cymru held their 4 seats. In Northern Ireland, Nationalist MPs outnumber Unionists at Westminster for the first time. The Democratic Unionists lost their deputy leader, Nigel Dodds. He was beaten by Sinn Féin in North Belfast. The DUP is still the largest party in Northern Ireland, but it's down to 8 MPs. Between them, Sinn Féin and the nationalist SDLP have 9. The pound and shares have surged after the Conservatives won their clear majority. Sterling rose to its highest level against the dollar since May last year and also jumped to a 3-year high against the euro. on hopes that the big majority would remove uncertainty over Brexit. There is, of course, lots more on the election online. You can look up the results in every constituency using our interactive map, and you can get live reaction and analysis from the experts. It's all on our website and the BBC News app.
Good morning. You join us live at Westminster, and we are going to pause here and go straight to Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader's house. He's just emerged in Islington North. Let's listen in. Well, that was quick. He's come out of his house. You can see there is a police presence there, and a lot of people hoping to hear a word from the Labour leader this morning after that disastrous result for Labour overnight, but he's chosen not to speak to the press there. We understand, or we've heard, that he may be going to Islington Town Hall now. Perhaps it is there that we will hear from the Labour leader, and in that case we will bring you those pictures as soon as he arrives there and we see what he has to say. In the meantime, we're going to cross to Birmingham, and Victoria Derbyshire has been there with voters for us this morning. Victoria. See what he has to say.
Thank you very much, Emily. We're here in the library of Birmingham with Henry and Claudia and Maya. And Henry is a lifelong Labour voter. Apart from yesterday, for the very first time, you voted Conservative. Tell us why.
Well, basically, I've just become disillusioned with the Labour Party in general. I'm not saying I've got total faith in the Conservatives either, but there just seems to be the better option at the moment.
Was your hand quivering over the box?
Not really, no. I made my mind up what I was going to do way back when the election was announced. As I say, I don't think the Labour Party are really united. I think there's fractures amongst them all the time.
You too, Claudia, are a Labour supporter. How are you feeling, and how are you feeling about people like Henry?
I feel quite shocked, to be honest. Kind of despairing, I suppose. I think the most...
Shocked that Henry voted Conservative?
Yeah, I feel like there's been such a lack of empathy with everyone, and for me it's kind of confusing that people have now decided, in the face of change, that they want change, and they're deciding to re-elect a party that hasn't brought change about.
Well, all I can say is that I've voted for Conservative because in my heart I believe they are the party that stands to do more than what the Labour Party are. There's all that infighting with them all the time, even when you come to even Brexit, there's no real stance to what way they're going forward with it. The one thing that Boris Johnson has said, he'll get it done. I believe he will get it done, and it's been going on for that long now. I think this country has become a laughing stock. I mean, we need to get it done, and simple as that.
Mayor, you voted Conservative. How are you feeling this morning?
Oh, I did vote for Conservative. I feel over the moon that they have had a very good victory. And the reason I voted for Conservative, because I was one of the 17.4 million who voted for Brexit. And there were definitely reasons for going ahead with Brexit.
What does, beyond Brexit, Henry, what else do you want from Boris Johnson? You heard him this morning thanking people like yourself, and he says he's going to repay your trust. What else do you want from him beyond Brexit?
Beyond Brexit, as long as the party is solid going forward, really to invest in the National Health Service. You hear all sorts of different things. Everybody's promising you different things. Health service, infrastructure, more nurses, more care. Basically, I've had first-hand experience of for 7 or 8 years with my wife passing away, going through the hospital care.
Under the Conservatives, is that?
It was under the Conservatives, but I mean, I can't. Whoever's in power needs to invest needs to invest far more money in the health service. They all talk about it. It's their thing that they're going to do when they get in. It's the big common denominator. But when they get in, it's not happening.
What does Labour need to do to change? What does Labour need to do to win you back? Let me ask you, Claudia, first.
I think they kind of need to go back to their roots. To be honest, I'm quite shocked that people like yourself can vote for Conservative when Boris Johnson couldn't even look at a child lying on the floor of a hospital. Like, that honestly astounds me. And I think Labour need to kind of reattach themselves to the community. Like, I think at the moment politics has been such a divisive topic for the entire nation. Like, I've never known a time to be so divisive, like I say, in a country, and it just shocks me, honestly.
Mayor, you're looking forward to leaving the EU on January the 31st?
Yes, I think the country needs to move forward. The country has been on a standstill for 3.5 years with the referendum and not moving ahead. At least we need a light at the end of the tunnel so that the government can move forward with the other local problems like the NHS, policing.
You're actually a retired NHS consultant. You trust the Conservatives on the NHS?
Yes, I do, because I have been...
Even though they've been in power since 2010, and you were telling me earlier about...
I have been in the NHS since 1975, and I've seen how the NHS has gone on, and particularly in the last 20 years. Now, there have been reasons, particularly financial reasons, and the way the Labour budget deficit was going in 2009 and 2010. Obviously, the Conservatives had to bring some austerity measures. Now, the budget is in a surplus of 19 billion, and the Conservatives can do definite job, and they're not promising billions and billions.
Henry, can Labour win you back at all? What do they need to do?
I think what they need to do is get more solid as a party.
Unite?
Yeah, unite properly behind one leader.
Do you want Jeremy Corbyn to stand down today?
Stand down today and get their time together to chat amongst themselves, to get a definite leader and everyone to find out what the policy is to go forward and all go that way with the policy.
What do you think went wrong for Labour, Claudia?
I think it was down to the people, to be honest. I think
the people who voted?
Yeah, everyone who voted. I think people need to have a think about what they're voting for, and for me...
So it's because of the electorate? Labour don't need to look at themselves going forward? I mean, they've lost
I feel like
4
Labour
elections.
have lost their way slightly, and Jeremy Corbyn, I'm not professing to be a Jeremy Corbyn fangirl by any means. I think, like you say, possibly the lesser of two evils for Boris Johnson, personally, looking at him as an individual. But I think people need to think about what they're actually voting for, and now the decision has been made, like, we're stuck with it. People are going to have to think about what they want in the future, because the next 5 years are done.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you very much. Thanks for your patience. I know you've got to get back to work, so we're really grateful, Henry. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Back to you, Emily.
Victoria, thanks very much. You'll remember 24 hours ago there was much talk about which of the big beasts could be toppled if the night didn't go their way, if there were scalps to be had. In the end, they were not cabinet ministers. They were from the Labour side and, of course, the Lib Dem leader herself. You might have seen the moment that veteran Labour MP Dennis Skinner lost his Bolsover seat. He's held it for nearly 50 years, and we can show you the result coming out of Bolsover overnight. This has now been taken extraordinarily by the Conservatives. Mark Fletcher there on 21,000 votes. Dennis Skinner then pushed into second place. The man they called the Beast of Bolsover, the man who nobody could remember without that constituency behind him. And you can see perhaps the share there, 47% for the Conservatives in Bolsover. It's that kind of moment, become dubbed the Portillo moment, those moments that really you'll remember when you've forgotten all the rest of the detail from these sorts of nights. It's the moments like Bolsover that you'll remember. It was an extraordinary change. You can see the Labour share of the vote dropping down 16%. The Conservatives and the Brexit Party both picking up in their wake. And what was extraordinary about that in particular was that, of course, the Beast of Bolsover, Dennis Skinner himself, was an ardent Brexiteer, a close fan of Corbyn. He wasn't wasn't going on a different platform. Labour to Conservatives then on 11% swing, and it was clearly a very good night there for the Conservatives on their message and ousting a man who would have become, I think, the father of the House. Let's go to our correspondent who is there, Rob. I wonder if the news has sunk in amongst Bolsovians, Rob.
Well, Emily, there's people here just startled really by this result. Even those that swapped over to the Conservatives are slightly shocked by their own decision. One woman told me her hand was trembling over the ballot paper as she put the cross in the blue box for the first time in her life. The question I kept asking is, why did you go over to the Conservatives? And the answer was one word: Brexit. In almost every instance, that message that Boris kept hammering away, that catchphrase, get Brexit done, it's oven ready. People were repeating, get Brexit done to me on the streets here. It had clearly resonated with a high Leave voting area. And round the corner from here is Bolsover Castle, a symbol really of fortress Labour. You know, this was a Labour stronghold. Even a few years ago, if you'd have suggested that this would go red to blue, I don't think many people would have believed you. Now, Dennis Skinner is 87, and there are some people here who said he should have retired. David Cameron once taunted him in the Commons and said, you've got a good pension, it's time you went. He was a very colourful character. Whatever your political colours, I don't think anyone could doubt that.
Extraordinary. Rob, thanks very much. Well, joining us now, former Cabinet Secretary Lord O'Donnell. Nice to see you. Gus, I know you couldn't hear what Rob was saying, but just a reflection for a moment on what it is like in politics when it becomes intensely personal, when you see these characters who feel like they've always been in the building behind us, suddenly not there.
Well, yeah, I've seen that, like John Major, you know, when he's lost an election. I mean, it's very personal. It's not at all something you can just gloss over. You know, it's been your life, and they've contributed an enormous amount. So I kind of feel for all the losers, but it's the nature of politics. That's the world. They know they're in it. So,
what do you make of the shape of the country today? I mean, you have that advantage of one step back from the front line now, and when you look at it, I mean, did you ever think you would see this in your lifetime?
Very surprised. I did join the civil service in 1979, so I remember the 80s, I remember the bigger majority, but it is unusual, most certainly. And it's unusual in that it's different from the 80s because we now have the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, so Boris Johnson can and will almost certainly go on for 5 years, and then we'll have another election where he might win again. So,
I mean, from your experience, you'd assume when we look back at, for example, the trilogy of Thatcher elections or the Blair ones, that if you get a majority this big at first, you are in for another term.
Well, that's right. Usually it takes a while. And what would happen then is, of course, the Prime Minister had the ability to choose when to go. So if after 4 years they were doing well in the polls, they could just say, right, let's have it now. And so that power has gone away from them. But the chances are that when you've got this size of a majority, it will last.
Gus O'Donnell, we're going to ask you to stay with us over the top of the hour, and we'll have plenty more to discuss here. But you are watching a BBC election special on the day the Conservatives won their biggest majority since 1987. Hello, good afternoon. You join us live in Westminster, where Boris Johnson is set to begin a new term as Prime Minister after the Conservatives win their biggest majority since 1987. The Tory leader has returned to Downing Street after visiting Buckingham Palace to ask the Queen for permission to form a government. Overnight, his gamble to hold a December election paid off. He now has a majority of 78 and a mandate, he says, to leave the EU.
With this mandate and this majority, we will at last be able to do what?
sneak.
Prime Minister has said he'll work flat out and has pledged to earn the support of people who, in his words, may have lent him their vote.
It was an awful night for Labour, losing 59 seats, many of them in places the party has held for decades. Jeremy Corbyn said the results were very disappointing.
I want to also make it clear that I will not lead the party in any future general election campaign. I will discuss with our party to ensure there is a process now of reflection.
A strong result for the SNP, who now hold 48 seats out of the 59 in Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon says it sends a clear message for a second independence referendum.
That independence referendum that was very much at the heart of the SNP's campaign, there is a renewed, refreshed, strengthened mandate for that.
Liberal Democrat leader Jo Swinson quits after she loses her own seat to the SNP and the party fails to improve its position at Westminster.
For millions of people in our country, these results will bring dread and dismay, and people are looking for hope.
And we're in Birmingham with voters. We will hear from a lifelong Labour supporter who yesterday voted Conservative for the very first time, and a gutted Labour voter who says her party's lost its way over Brexit.
Well, the result of the election means big change in the House of Commons and for the country. The UK will now leave the European Union by the end of next month. We'll be speaking to the main parties and we'll bring you all the events and the reaction from here throughout the day. Hello, a very good afternoon to you. Welcome to viewers here in the UK on BBC One and the BBC News Channel, and around the globe on BBC World News. Here at Westminster, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson is ready to form a new government after an overwhelming win by the Conservatives in the general election. The Tories have a majority of 78, with just one seat still to declare. Mr Johnson has called his victory a new dawn and said he now has a mandate to get the UK to leave the European Union at the end of January. No ifs, no buts. Jeremy Corbyn said Labour's result was a disappointing night and that he would not fight a future general election. The Liberal Democrats had a terrible night as the party leader Jo Swinson lost her seat and quit. But the SNP did well, coming close to sweeping the board in Scotland. Let's take a look for you at the result as they stand. The Conservatives then on 364 seats, up 47. Labour now on 203, they are down 59. The SNP have 48 MPs, an increase of 13. The Liberal Democrats only have 11, down 1. The DUP have lost 2, they're on 8. Sinn Féin don't take their seats in Westminster, but they have 7. And this is the vote share in Great Britain, which shows us what this would look like under a more proportional system rather than the first past the post one we use in a general election. The Conservatives then on 45% share of the vote, which is interestingly just an increase on share of 1%. Labour have seen their share go down 8%. They're on 33. The Lib Dems are on 12. Slight gains for them, 4% gains there. The SNP are on 4 and they have made gains of 1%. The Greens on 3. And the Brexit Party on 2 with no MPs. We'll bring you all the reaction and speak to all the main parties, look at what the result means for Westminster and for Brexit. Stay with us throughout the day. Right now we're going to go to Downing Street and to Clive Myrie, who's there for us.
Fine. OK, sounds good.
Yeah, hi there, Emily. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, arriving back here from his audience with the Queen in the last 40 minutes or so. And even out here, we're a good 30 or 40 yards away from the shiny black door, we heard that huge reception of champagne corks popping, possibly, but lots of cheers and shouts of well done for Boris Johnson on his arrival back here to begin what looks as if it will be an eventful 5 years in that building behind me. With me is our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. We shouldn't forget, Norman, that David Cameron tried it. Theresa May tried it. Boris Johnson tried once to get out. Actually, I'm going to leave you, Norm. We've got to go up to Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon, we understand, is going to give a speech
now. Good afternoon. Thank you all very much for coming along here today. When I launched the SNP campaign in this very room just over a month ago, I could not reasonably have hoped for a more emphatic victory in this election. Last night, the SNP won an incredible 80% of seats in Scotland, an overwhelming endorsement of our campaign, message and vision. It is clear, beyond any doubt, that the kind of future desired by the majority in Scotland is very different to that chosen by much of the rest of the UK. Scotland has rejected Boris Johnson and the Tories, and yet again we have said no to Brexit. During this campaign, I said repeatedly that all elections are important. Of course they are, but that this one really mattered. I said that the very future of Scotland was on the line. Last night was indeed a watershed moment. So today, as we reflect on the outcome, we should also look ahead. This morning, I want to address both the people of Scotland and the Prime Minister directly. To the people of Scotland, I want to say a simple but heartfelt thank you. Thank you for the overwhelming victory you gave the SNP last night. The SNP will never, ever take you for granted. We will continue to work every single day to earn your trust, however you voted last night, both in government at Holyrood and in opposition at Westminster. We will focus relentlessly on building a fairer and a more prosperous country for everyone who lives here. We will continue to promote the outward-looking internationalist values that are so firmly at the heart of the SNP's vision for Scotland. And we will do whatever we can to protect Scotland from what I fear will be a deeply damaging Tory government. That means we will stand firm in our defence of our National Health Service. We will resist to the very best of our ability the ultra-Brexit Tory ideology that threatens a race to the bottom on issues like environmental protections, food standards and workers' rights. And we will stand up for the rights of those from other European countries who have chosen to live here. And I want to briefly address them directly today too. I am very aware that for you this may be the most difficult day since the morning after the Brexit vote. So let me say this again, and from my heart, you are welcome here, we value your contribution, and I will fight with everything I have to protect your right to call Scotland your home. Now, of course, elections can be invigorating, but also bruising events. So let me congratulate all those candidates last night who won, but also commiserate with those who lost seats. Despite the hard-fought nature of this election campaign, I believe and I hope that we can, in Scotland, now agree on two fundamental points. Firstly, it is now clear beyond any doubt that the overwhelming majority of people in Scotland do want to remain in the European Union. That verdict was first delivered in the referendum in 2016. It was reinforced in the general election of 2017. It was strengthened in the European election earlier this year, and last night it was emphatically confirmed. Westminster has ignored people in Scotland for more than 3 years. Last night, the people of Scotland said enough. It is time for Boris Johnson to start listening. I accept, regretfully, that he has a mandate for Brexit in England. But he has no mandate whatsoever to take Scotland out of the European Union. If he presses ahead, he will drive a coach and horses through the very idea that is supposed to underpin the UK, the idea that the Union is a partnership of equal nations. And that brings into very sharp relief the second fundamental principle that I believe we in Scotland can unite around, that Scotland's future must be in Scotland's hands. Now, I acknowledge that not absolutely everyone who voted SNP yesterday is ready to support independence. But the point of unity that I do believe exists is this one. Whether or not Scotland becomes an independent country must be a matter for the people who live here. And let me stress, for all of us who live here, no matter where we come from. It's not a decision for any Westminster Prime Minister, and certainly not for one who suffered a crushing defeat in Scotland last night. The Tories fought this campaign in Scotland on a single issue. They spoke quite literally about nothing else. They bombarded people in Scotland with the same relentless message day after day and night after night. They said that a vote for them was a vote to deny people in Scotland the right to decide our own future. They said it was a vote to reject an independence referendum. Well, yesterday, the people of Scotland decided instead to reject the Tories. The stunning election win last night for the SNP renews, reinforces and strengthens the mandate we have from previous elections to offer the people of Scotland a choice over their future. That mandate says that it is for the Scottish Parliament, not a Westminster government, to decide whether and when there should be a new referendum on independence. So given the verdict of the people of Scotland last night, the Scottish Government will next week publish the detailed democratic case for a transfer of power to enable a referendum to be put beyond legal challenge. I have been clear that a referendum must be the responsibility of the Scottish Parliament. This is not about asking Boris Johnson or any other Westminster politician for permission. It is instead an assertion of the democratic right of the people of Scotland to determine our own future. Given what I fear a Tory government now has in store for Scotland, that right to choose our own future has never been more important or more urgent. So to the Prime Minister, let me be very clear. This is not simply a demand that I or the SNP are making. It is the right of the people of Scotland. And you, as the leader of a defeated party in Scotland, have no right to stand in the way. In an independent Scotland, we will always get the governments we vote for. We will have full control of the powers and the levers needed to build a truly fair and a more prosperous country. We can take our place as an equal partner with our closest friends in the rest of the UK and across Europe and the world. The people of Scotland have spoken. It is time now to decide our own future. Thank you very much indeed.
Nicola Sturgeon speaking in Edinburgh after that incredibly successful electoral night for the SNP and saying that independence is now the right of the people of Scotland to choose, and a message to the Prime Minister that he has no right to stand in their way. Let's cross to our correspondent Lorna Gordon, who's in Edinburgh. Lorna, no change in the message there, of course. What does that mean in terms of delivery? We know Boris Johnson won't allow that second referendum, and she has said that she won't go it through an illegal means. What happens then?
Well, I think we are setting the two countries up for a big constitutional standoff. Nothing Nicola Sturgeon said in that speech just now was entirely unexpected, but there were big gains for the SNP here in Scotland overnight, and she said those gains renew, reinforce and strengthen her mandate, the SNP's mandate in Scotland, for Scottish people to have a right to choose their future. She said she will set out next week a detailed democratic case for the transfer of power. We've always known that at some point before Christmas she would request what's called a Section 30 order, that is the transfer of power from Westminster to hold a referendum here in Scotland on Scottish independence. But as you say, Boris Johnson has made very clear that he will say no to that. He sees another referendum on Scottish independence as a once in a generation event. So where do we go from here? Well, there are increasing rumours and speculation that perhaps there might be legal action over that matter, but the SNP are also pushing the line that Boris Johnson can't refuse because frankly, he has no right to stand in the way. Their vote went down here in Scotland, where the SNPs went up significantly. They won over 80% of the seats here, a 45% share of the vote. The map here has really turned SNP yellow, but it is hard to see how you reconcile these two very opposing positions when it comes to the constitutional question over Scotland's future and foresee big arguments ahead.
Lorna, thanks very much indeed. Well, with us now, former Cabinet Secretary Lord Gus O'Donnell. There is so much to digest this morning, Gus. The sort of ease with which that result seems to have taken hold is the narrative of a Conservative majority, and they've done extraordinarily well. But it belies the complications that lie ahead, certainly in Scotland, as we've heard from Lorna, and also presumably in Northern Ireland, in Ireland. Northern Ireland now have, for the first time, more nationalist MPs than unionists. That presumably starts to influence the balance of power there as well.
Absolutely. I mean, from a civil service point of view, you breathe a sigh of relief that all those complicated things about hung parliaments, minority governments have gone. You've got a strong majority. On the other hand, within that majority, you're absolutely right. You've just heard Nicola Sturgeon talking about wanting a referendum. The Prime Minister has the right to say no, and that will create tensions. Northern Ireland, the same, as you said. The Nationalists now, for the first time, having more seats than Unionists. That's going to create problems because those things aren't just separate constitutional issues. For both of those countries, Brexit is a big issue as well. Assuming Boris goes ahead, delivers Brexit, which I am, and we leave on January the 31st, that does create problems and reinforces the independence campaigns, I think you'll see, both in Scotland and the view in Northern Ireland that there are greater attractions to being closer to the Republic. So it makes life more difficult for him.
And does how well we do on the next stage of Brexit alter that? To the extent that Nicola Sturgeon has always used Brexit as the motivator, if you like, for needing Scotland to go independent. If Brexit delivers prosperity, success, a brand new dawn of trade deals, all the things that she at the moment doesn't believe it can, does that then shift things?
Well, I'm afraid the timescales don't work for that. So future trade deals with third-party countries like the US are quite a long way off. Whatever President Trump might say, I'm afraid that's not going to happen for quite a long time.
It's not just President Trump, it's Boris Johnson as well.
Exactly.
So, I mean, when you're saying trade deals are a long way off, you're telling us that his promise to leave by December 2020 with a great deal is not possible?
Well, no. There's two things here. There's the UK-EU trade deal, right? So the adverse consequences of being outside the EU won't be felt for quite a while in terms of that trade deal. And the whole point about a trade deal with third countries is that it'll take us a while to make any great note. I mean, we could do ones with countries like Canada, but it's a tiny proportion of our trade.
There's also a question of the shape of government now. We heard rumours that the Foreign Office could look, the Foreign Commonwealth Office could look very different under a Boris Johnson government. He would get rid of the international development and presumably the overseas development budget as well.
Well, the leaks have suggested that the Department for International Development might be folded into the Foreign Office. Now, my guess is they would still keep two separate cabinet ministers, but they would certainly, when he does his first big spending review, and he's now got a chance under fixed-term Parliament Acts Act to have a 5-year term. He might do a 5-year spending review. He might well decide that he's not going to stick with a 0.7% commitment. That would require legislation, of course, and then use that money in different ways, hopefully still to look at helping the world's poor, but in ways that might also stay outside the things that are normally counted as aid. So, for example, helping on climate change and issues like that. So there's possibilities
there's
for him.
room sort of thing.
Yes, and that's where he needs to sit down and I'd say not rush into sorting out a cabinet yet, but think about the machinery of government that will work for what he wants to do.
You think we won't get the cabinet for what, another day?
I'm hoping he'll wait because he's got to sort out with a bigger majority the kind of Brexit deal he can do. He's got more options open. And I would say delivering a softer Brexit helps him with Northern Ireland and with Scotland, helps allay those fears that they're really going to suffer. I mean, a no-deal Brexit would be really bad for Northern Ireland and Scotland, particularly bad for Northern Ireland. And I think he'll be even more aware of that now with these results.
It's fascinating to hear you still talk of a no-deal Brexit, so it hasn't gone away even at this point.
I think it was very unlikely. I think it's become even less likely.
Right.
I'm just urging the Prime Minister to carry on and get his deal through.
Nice to see you, Gus O'Donnell. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to sweep right across our newsroom now and over to the Election Results Centre with Christian Fraser, who's been picking out some of the big swings from Labour to Conservatives overnight.
OK, let's take stock. You'll see that we're still missing one seat. It's this one down here in Cornwall, St Ives. It's a Conservative Lib Dem marginal. There is some bad weather in the Scilly Isles, so we won't get that until later this afternoon. But on the basis of this, it is, as we've been saying, the best result for the Conservatives since 1987. Conversely, for the Labour Party, it is the worst since the war, worse even than Michael Foot in 1983 in terms of seats. And for the Liberal Democrats, depending on that seat we just mentioned, it could be worse than even 2017, though they would point you to their vote share, which is up 4%. I'd like to draw your attention just to that, though. It's been a personal triumph for Boris Johnson, no doubt about that, but he's only put on 1.2% on what Theresa May had in 2017. So what's been different? Well, the difference is that the Labour vote in working class post-industrial areas has collapsed. So you've seen that in North East Wales, you've seen it in the West Midlands, in South Yorkshire, in the North East of England. And when you look at, and you really drill down into the numbers, you'll see that the Conservative vote share is higher where there is a higher percentage of working class people. I'll show you what I mean. So these are seats that have all gone from red to blue. Bassetlaw, Redcar, Scunthorpe, Lee, Dudley North, Great Grimsby, Sedgefield, Rother Valley. Let's have a look at Bassetlaw. It was the biggest swing of the night. So John Mann standing down, former mining town in Nottinghamshire, big Leave area. You look at the vote share, you can see Labour's vote collapsing, the Brexit Party eating into a little bit of it, but look at that massive swing, 18%. Another one, Dudley North. It's never been anything but Labour, OK? Big Leave area. Again, you look at the vote share, almost a straight swap, Conservative to Labour, another massive swing. Here's another extraordinary one, Sedgefield, the former seat of Tony Blair. In 2005, he had a majority of over 18,000 after 9 years of Labour opposition. Look at that. The Conservatives now have a majority of 4,500. Again, another big vote share change. Brexit Party eating into that again. And we'll just pick out one last one because this is rather interesting. Rother Valley, it's never been anything but Tory. It's been Labour since the First World War, since 1918. Big Leave area, but look at this. This is the one that Nigel Farage will point to. The Brexit Party eating massively into the Labour vote. And again, a very big swing from Labour to the Conservatives.
Christian, thanks. Now, 2 of the 3 Wolverhampton seats in the West Midlands saw the Conservatives gain from Labour. Phil Mackey is there. Phil, what can you tell us?
Well, 2 out of 3 went, as you said. The third might easily have been won by the Conservatives last night as well if there hadn't been a Brexit Party candidate who took a significant number of votes off the Conservative. It was a very narrow majority held by Pat McFadden, but Labour MPs Eleanor Smith and Emma Reynolds have both lost their seats. part of the picture across the West Midlands, of course. Just been hearing about Dudley going to the Conservatives, but Stoke-on-Trent, West Bromwich, these have been Labour strongholds for generations, and they turned blue last night. So what really I've been trying to find out here is about people who've traditionally voted Labour. Some of them still have, some of them switched last night. I've been asking them what their motives were for the way that they voted.
We've got 5 years now to get things done, and we can get Brexit done on time at the end of January and get this country moving, and thank goodness we managed to remove that stranglehold of the Hung Parliament.
Well, I abstained. I thought Boris Johnson you don't trust, and the others, I think I've got more sense than them.
What about Labour now? How would they win your trust back?
If they got a better leader and better people who you think would be good in the cabinet.
I'm not a Corbyn supporter, but I prefer the policies that Labour had over what the Conservatives had. So.
Even though you were not a Corbyn supporter, you still voted Labour, did you?
Yeah.
And so there's not. What do you think Labour should do now to try and win the country back?
Get rid of Jeremy Corbyn, I guess.
It wasn't just that person telling me that. Lots of people have been saying the same thing. I think in the West Midlands, that slightly further left-wing version of the Labour Party doesn't really carry much weight. Wolverhampton South West has flipped between Labour and Conservatives over the years. This used to be Enoch Powell's seat many years ago, but Wolverhampton North East, which Emma Reynolds lost, well, that's been Labour for as long as I could remember, and probably for generations as well. So a real sea change here in the West Midlands. The trick is for Boris Johnson and the Conservatives is they're going to have to keep those people on their side if they're going to win the next election, and they're going to have to invest in places like Wolverhampton. That's what people want to see happening, not just here but across the West Midlands.
Phil, thanks very much indeed. Now, the Liberal Democrats have been hoping to take Cheltenham, but it was a Conservative hold. We're going to cross to our correspondent there, Fiona Lambden. Disappointing night for the Lib Dems there and in other places, Fiona.
Yes, as you say, Emily, it had always been a two-horse race here in Cheltenham. We were here just 2 weeks ago talking to voters, whether it be coming out the theatre, whether they would be in the pub or just here at the Christmas market. And everyone could agree on one thing, just how much literature they were getting through their doors from the Liberal Democrats. There were posters everywhere, and that was because the Liberal Democrats were working so hard. Cheltenham was number 6 on their target hit list. This was one they were so keen to take, and they hoped that their promise to revoke Article 50 would entice traditional Conservative voters to switch party at the last moment, because in 2016 57% of this town voted to remain in the EU. But last night that didn't happen. Alex Chalk has been MP here for 4 years, and last night he held on to his seat. This is what he said afterwards.
It was very close, and for a time I didn't think I'd won, and just to come through feels amazing. I just want to express my gratitude to the people of Cheltenham who showed faith in me, and I just want to make this point because it was close, that I want to represent people from all political backgrounds. We've got to start healing our nation, and that means healing our locality, our constituency as well, and I will stand up for people whether they backed me or whether they didn't back me. It's so important.
Yeah, so the Conservatives only got 48% of the share, whereas the Liberal Democrats, only got a 46%. So it's very, very close here. So speaking to people here this morning, I spoke to the man manning the flower market this morning. He said on the way to work, literally his whole bus was celebrating. They were so excited. But then you can speak to another group of people, some people just by the German sausage market around the corner, and they said they were so desperately disappointed because they thought the Liberal Democrats were doing absolutely everything they could, and they so nearly won. So it's a really divided town, but yes, the Conservatives holding their seat.
Fiona, thanks very much indeed. Now, the Wigan MP Lisa Nandy used her victory speech to demand Labour listens to its former voters, and we can talk to her now. Lisa, this won't have come as any surprise to you. You predicted this, you warned of it, you saw it happening almost like a slow motion car crash. I wonder why you and so many of your colleagues felt that you couldn't stop it.
Well, I think the honest truth is that this has been a very long time coming. I have been talking about it for quite some time, but actually in towns like Wigan, we've been seeing lifelong Labour voters moving away from us, feeling actually that they haven't left Labour, that Labour has left them for nearly 20 years. The last time that Labour won a majority in the House of Commons was 2005. That is a very long time ago, and since that time we've seen so many warning signs in towns like this. We've seen falling turnout, then we saw a very dramatic spike in support for UKIP in towns like mine, which have consistently rejected the far right. Then we had the vote to leave the European Union, and over again what we haven't done is listen to what people are saying to us. And that's one of the reasons why I think now is not the moment to rush to judgment. Now is not the time to say to people in towns like mine, we know what went wrong and we are here to tell you that. Now is the time, quite frankly, for us to have a moment of humility, to be quiet and to listen to what people have been trying to tell us for a very long time.
Understood, Lisa, but I'm just trying to get a sense there of when you say the warning signs were there for years, are you saying it was Labour's approach to Brexit that was wrong, or do you believe that the party became too metropolitan or out of touch or didn't connect with towns in the way that it clearly connected better with cities? I mean, was this about the leader, Corbyn, or was this just about the Brexit strategy?
Brexit is indicative of a wider problem, I think, which is that when we got that vote to leave the European Union, we immediately rushed to judgment. Many of the voters in towns like mine were told that they were stupid, that they were racist, that they hadn't understood the question, that they believed lies from people like Nigel Farage and David Cameron. People in towns like mine are not daft. They didn't want to be in the European Union, but a lot of what lay behind that was a sentiment that increasingly they had very little control over what happened in their own lives. Towns like mine need real power in order to be able to set the agenda. And the truth is that what has happened in Labour over a very long period of time is that we've concentrated that power and that decision making outside of these areas where, you know, there are lots of great people in our towns who go out day after day knocking on doors and working for Labour in our communities, but most of the decisions that we make are made by people who are very, very far away from the reality of lives in our communities, and that is something that really desperately needs to change, and people have been telling us that for a long time. Now is the moment when we absolutely have to start listening to that, and we have to start thinking about what is it that unites places like Tottenham, where my friend David Lammy is a Member of Parliament, where people absolutely need a Labour government, and unites Wigan and Lee next door, where my good friend Jo Platt just lost her seat last night. What is it that unites those things? Labour only wins when we can bring together those two very different parts of the country, and we need to start seriously thinking about what is it that will do that, and how do we get this right?
So when you're thinking about your next leader, do you think it might be better if they didn't come from Islington and came perhaps from, I don't know, Wigan, Lisa Nandy?
Well, to be really honest, I don't know what I'm going to do next, and I think anybody who has rushed into this thinking that they have all the answers has taken precisely the wrong lessons from last night. What we have been told in towns like this for a long time is that we're not listening, and we need to have a bit of humility, and we need to be quiet, and we need to start listening to people. There are things to be said. There is lots to be said, and I do think that there is hope out there for the Labour Party. I didn't detect any sense over the course of this campaign that people really feel an enthusiasm either for the Tory agenda or any great affection for Boris Johnson either. But what they do feel very strongly is at the moment there is a vacuum that nobody is filling. That is where the hope lies for Labour. And what I said last night to many people, the lifelong Labour voters in my constituency and many others around the country who told me that they need a Labour government, they want a Labour government, but they couldn't vote for Labour in this election, is that I will do everything within my power to bring Labour back home to them.
And Lisa, how easily then do you think you work with a Conservative government on these issues for areas like yours? Your words are almost the same as those of Dom Cummings, the chief advisor to Boris Johnson, who left this morning saying, I mean, obviously he will phrase it differently, but I think you're coming from the same place. The average educated Remainer campaigner types who've waved around for 8 years for the last few months and didn't understand what was going on were driving everyone mad. Hopefully now they'll learn, because it's not good for the country, the whole dynamic to carry on. Do you at this point feel that you are closer to Boris Johnson's Conservatives and what they are offering the people than to Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party?
No, I mean, this is one of the worst days I can remember, but I think you've just found a way to make it worse by telling me that I agree with Dominic Cummings. And actually, I really don't, because the task for Labour is not to pit one part of the country that needs a Labour government against another. The task for Labour has always been to work out how you bring those very different parts of the country together. That is the only way that we've ever won power and managed to transform things for people. And the problem with what's happened in the Labour Party over the last few years is that we've been told to pick a side. You are Leave or you'll Remain. Well, the truth is that in London I'm a Leaver and in Wigan I'm seen as a Remainer. And somehow we need to bridge that divide. And that is what I've been trying to do for the last 4 years. I represent a part of the world where 2/3 of people voted to leave the European Union and 1/3 voted to remain. I am their Member of Parliament, I am their voice, and I have to stand up for both and find the common ground and the compromise that enables us to move forward as the country. That is the task facing the Labour Party now, and it's important that we learn the right lessons from this. We don't pick a side, we don't divide people like the Tories. We've got to compromise and we've got to work together and move forwards.
We wish you luck with that. Nisa Nandi, thanks for joining us. You're watching BBC Election 2019. More from here in just a moment, but first we're going to cross to the newsroom and we join Louise Minchin, who has a summary of the day's stories.
Thanks, Emily. Good afternoon. The Conservatives have won their biggest general election majority since Margaret Thatcher in 1987, after claiming scores of seats from Labour in its traditional heartlands in the north of England. The party has a Commons majority of 78, with just 1 seat still to declare, and their share of the vote has risen to 45%, while Labour's plunged by 8% to 33%. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has met the Queen at Buckingham Palace to ask for her permission to form a government. He has said the Conservatives' resounding victory in the general election gives him the people's mandate to pursue Britain's withdrawal from the European Union and promised to work night and day to repay the trust of voters.
In winning this election, we have won votes and the trust of people who have never voted Conservative before, and people who have always voted for other parties. Those people want change. We cannot, must not let them down. And in delivering change, we must change too. We must recognise the incredible reality that we now speak as a one-nation Conservative party, literally for everyone from Woking to Workington.
Jeremy Corbyn said it was a disappointing night and he would not lead Labour at any future election. But Mr Corbyn made clear he wouldn't be stepping down immediately, despite many in the party laying the blame for Labour's poor performance at his door. He put the result, which was the party's worst since 1935, down to the issue of Brexit, which he said had polarised politics.
I want to also make it clear that I will not lead the party in any future general election campaign. I will discuss with our party to ensure there is a process now of reflection on this result and on the policies that the party will take going forward. And I will lead the party during that period to ensure that discussion takes place and we move on into the future.
The SNP has made big gains across Scotland, with Nicola Sturgeon saying the country had sent a clear message on a second independence referendum. With all of the Scottish results in, the SNP has won 48 of the country's 59 seats, 13 more than it won in 2017. The Conservatives have won 6 seats, the Liberal Democrats 4 and Labour 1. Ms Sturgeon said it's now time for the people of Scotland to decide their own future.
Westminster has ignored people in Scotland for more than 3 years. Last night, the people of Scotland said enough. It is time for Boris Johnson to start listening. I accept, regretfully, that he has a mandate for Brexit in England, but he has no mandate whatsoever to take Scotland out of the European Union.
The most high-profile casualty has been the Liberal Democrat leader Jo Swinson, who lost her seat in East Dunbartonshire to the SNP by 149 votes and is stepping down. The party currently has 11 seats, winning a 12% share of the vote. Sir Ed Davey and Baroness Sal Brinton will be acting leaders of the party. Now Miss Swinson is no longer an MP. There's lots more on the election online. You can look up the results in every constituency using our interactive map, and you can get live reaction and analysis from the experts. It's all on our website and also the BBC News app. That's it. Now back to election 2019.
We will be heading to Belfast in a moment to get reaction to some of the interesting results there. But first, let's go to Christian Fraser to find out what the story has been overnight in Northern Ireland. Christian.
Yeah, Emily, records broken all over the map last night, and so it was in Northern Ireland. For the first time in history, the Nationalists have more seats in Northern Ireland than the Unionists. SDLP picking up 2, the DUP losing 2. They are still the biggest party in terms of vote share, but the big story of the night, the Alliance. So they are cross-party, they sit in the centre, they're neutral on the constitutional question of a united Ireland. And for Unionists, upset about the Brexit policies of Boris Johnson and upset at the DUP getting into bed with him, the Alliance a palatable option for them, and they've put on 9% in terms of vote share. But I can't emphasise enough what an absolute earthquake we've had in Belfast North, because the Westminster leader of the DUP, Nigel Dodds, has lost his seat. He's had it for 20 years. For those who don't know Belfast North, you have the Catholic Ardoin state in Belfast North, scene of a lot of the violence during the Troubles. It's been growing as a community. This was the seat that Sinn Féin wanted, and look who has taken it. John Finucane is the son of Pat Finucane, who, among others, did represent IRA members, and he was gunned down by the UDA in 1989. So he is now the member for Belfast North. Of course, Sinn Féin don't take their seats in Westminster. This is the seat that the Alliance picked up. Stephen Farry is the deputy leader of the Alliance. Just look at the vote share. This was the seat of Lady Sylvia Herman, the independent, who was standing down. The Alliance has put on 36% in terms of vote share in that seat. And the last one I just want to show you, because it is fascinating, this one. This is Foyle. So you have Derry and Londonderry in Foyle. This was the seat of John Hume, the SDLP leader, who had it for 20-odd years into 2005. And then the Sinn Féin snatched it back in 2017, only with a 169 majority. Now, look at that. That is a huge swing to the SDLP. I'll show you that in a second. What is going on there? Is it because Colm Eastwood was saying, look, you need a Remain voice in Westminster, Sinn Féin aren't taking their seats, send me to Westminster instead? Or was it the Lyra McKee issue? Remember the young journalist who was shot in April this year, and you might have heard the priest saying he didn't understand the politics of the extremes. Maybe it's a reaction to that. I don't know. We'll have to drill into the figures, but certainly an extraordinary result.
It really is. Christian, thanks very much indeed. We're going to stay with that story. Anita McVeigh is in Belfast. And as Christian was showing us there, Anita, the nationalist parties now have more MPs than the unionist parties. And if you look at what that does, actually, not just in Northern Ireland, but also in Scotland, I think one statistic has come out saying more voters have backed Remain parties over Leave parties to, would you believe it, a ratio of 52 to 48. So whilst Boris Johnson here talks about the majority for the Conservatives, it might feel very different where you are now.
Yes, I think so, Emily. And actually, it's worth remembering that none of the MPs here, that's neither Nationalist Unionist nor the Cross Community Alliance Party MP, actually back Boris Johnson's Brexit deal as it currently stands. None of them. And just picking up on that point that Christian was making about the Alliance Party, there was only one constituency out of the 18 here where the Alliance Party's vote share didn't actually go up. So a real shift to the centre ground here in Northern Ireland. Well, let's discuss all of this more now. I'm joined by Claire Rice, who is an academic at Newcastle University, at Queen's University here in Belfast, and also works on the Identities Project, which is exploring Brexit's impact on identity and governance in Northern Ireland. You had written before this election that Brexit was the fundamental underpinning to it. Assessing the results that we have, do you still agree with that?
I think I do. The reason I said it initially was because the way the pacts aligned themselves in Northern Ireland was very much along Leave and Remain type discourse, in contrast to being the usual sort of unionist nationalist type lines that we would see when any pacts would start to emerge here in Northern Ireland. I think the results last night show that very much there was a Brexit influence in how people chose to mark their tickets whenever they went into the ballot boxes yesterday. I think that has been seen in the way that the DUP have effectively taken quite a hammering in their votes. They've lost 2 seats, the seats that they did retain. They've lost large numbers of votes in pretty much all of the constituencies that they've continued to hold. And I think that has shown very much that there is a reaction going on towards their position on Brexit.
Yes, so to what extent do you think there has been a reaction to Sinn Féin's policy of abstentionism, i.e. not taking their seats at Westminster, to the DUP's position on Brexit? And how might all of that feed into the question of Stormont? When I've been over here covering the election in Northern Ireland, people have said, well, look, we know this is a Westminster election, but we really want to talk about Stormont as well. The Northern Ireland Assembly, out of action for nearly 3 years now. Is any of this going to make a difference to that?
I think it's a very interesting point about abstentionism, particularly looking at the Foyle result, where Sinn Féin had claimed the seat in the 2017 election, and by a huge majority now the SDLP have reclaimed that. And very much the difference between those two nationalist parties is the fact that Colm Eastwood of the SDLP will take a seat in the House of Commons. Of course, Sinn Féin have an abstentionist policy, so that's where a key difference is there. I think more generally in terms of what it might mean for Stormont, very much that is something that I've been struck by in this election, is that despite it being a Westminster election, so much of the conversation has been around the Assembly, getting the talks back going, getting the parties together, having a negotiation, and really thinking to the more domestic level of politics rather than Westminster. So it's been a really strange conversation that's being had, despite it being a national level election.
Claire Rice, thank you very much for your thoughts today. So, Emily, when Boris Johnson talks about one nation conservatism, which nation is he speaking to? Is it to Scotland? Is it to Northern Ireland? The results there suggest not. So possibly storing up some real issues, some real problematic issues for him to deal with in the coming months.
Anita, thanks very much indeed. We're going to head to Birmingham, talk to some voters there, and Victoria Derbyshire is there with them. Bye.
In the Library of Birmingham. Yes, good afternoon. We have Francesca and Michael and Liz and Amar and Ejal. Francesca, you voted Conservative. Tell us why.
I voted Conservative because I believe that people with disabilities deserve more, and I felt that out of all the manifestos, they were giving us most. Like, they want to give us more money for the NHS.
Have you forgiven the Conservatives for cutting disability benefits since 2010?
To be honest, this is my first time of voting, so I didn't really pay much attention to what the parties have been doing in the past. I just focused on what they want to do in future and read this year's manifesto.
Michael, you also voted Conservatives?
I did.
Conservative? Why?
Well, look, I think Boris has got the agenda to take this country forwards. First of all, we have to deliver on Brexit. And Boris has got a good deal to go ahead with that. He's got a plan to deliver on Brexit, and that has to be done, and it now will be done with this great Conservative majority. He's also, though, got a plan for the domestic agenda for the future. So, as we were mentioning just before, investing in the NHS, in schools, in roads, in hospitals, you know, the list goes on.
You're chairman of the
Of the Birmingham Young Conservatives.
You've been up all night?
I have, yes.
What's your mood right now?
I'm absolutely elated. Look, I wasn't. I would be happy with I was going to be happy with a small majority. We've got a very big majority. I think it's wonderful. It shows the people are backing our vision for the country. You know, we're gonna do what we promised.
Okay.
We're going to go forwards.
We're going to pause there, and we've got more of you to talk to, but we're going to hand back because I think we've got news from Jeremy Corbyn.
Victoria, thanks very much indeed. We heard from Jeremy Corbyn a little earlier that he thought it was a very disappointing night, but we've now had more reaction from the Labour leader to this election result. This is what he had to say.
Obviously very sad at the result we've achieved, and very sad at those colleagues that lost their seats in the election, and very sad for many people in this country who will now have a government that is continuing policies of austerity, and many of the poorest communities, I think, will suffer very badly from the economic strategy that I suspect the Prime Minister will take forward. But also, I have pride in our manifesto that we put forward, and all the policies we put forward, which actually had huge public support on issues of universal credit, the green industrial revolution, and investment for the future. But this election was taken over, ultimately, by Brexit, and we as a party represent people who both voted Remain and Leave, and my whole strategy was to reach out beyond the Brexit divide to try and bring people together, because ultimately the country has to come together.
Jeremy Corbyn speaking a few moments ago. The Labour MP Lucy Powell was re-elected to her Manchester Central constituency, and she is in our Salford studio. I would suggest that's not the most extraordinary speech of the day, Lucy. I remember when Ed Miliband, who you were working alongside, faced his results, and he said, I take absolute responsibility for that defeat. We heard no suggestion there, did we, from Jeremy Corbyn that he felt he was to blame. Indeed, he said he retained pride in the manifesto. I wonder what you make of it.
Well, look, I do think we need to hear a bit more contrition and humility, not just from Jeremy, but from across the party as well. We all have a responsibility for what is a seismic and formidable defeat that we have suffered, and we have to understand that and listen to what the voters have said to us. I don't think it's sufficient for us to simply put it down to one issue or another. It's a whole range of issues, and we need to be really humble in defeat and take our full responsibility for it. So I hope that Jeremy will, as he said he would do last night, really reflect on this result, and that means there being no-go areas, if you like, in terms of reflecting on that.
Lucy, you're being quite cautious, quite kind perhaps. You were one of those who resigned from the Corbyn shadow cabinet because you thought it was going nowhere and you didn't like the sense of direction. There have been 171, wasn't it, that signed the letter saying this, 172 that signed a letter saying this is not the way for us to go as a Labour Party. Why did that never get the momentum? What was stopping you from understanding that this had to change?
Well, look, I mean, that was 3 years ago now. We've had 2 general elections since then. So you learn one set of you learn some things from one of those elections, and you have to learn different things from this election here now. I mean, clearly, Brexit is a pattern underpinning this particular election, but the scale of the result is much broader than Brexit alone. And of course, Jeremy, as our leader, I hope, along with the rest of us, will have to take some responsibility for that. But I think to also to just pin the blame on the leadership and think that if we change leader tomorrow and Brexit will, no longer be an issue once we've left, that somehow it'll all spring back into place for us. I think that would be just as big as a mistake as anything else.
Does momentum still have a place in the Labour Party, in your view?
Well, look, I think some of this, we've got to put to one side some of this sort of factional divide. I think that's been an issue as well, as far as I'm concerned. I think we've presented ourselves as a divided party. And partly what we're seeing this morning, which I personally deeply regret, is different factions within the Labour Party trying to put their own answers on this defeat without having really understood the defeat first as a cue for, well, we were right all along. So on the one hand, some want to say this is just about Brexit and everything else about our party was fantastic and brilliant. Others want to say this is all about Jeremy Corbyn as leader. Neither are right. And we've all got to now collectively come together, deeply, objectively and honestly understand and listen to the electorate and move forward with a collective understanding. But if we continue to pick fights with one another saying, well, I was right all along and you were wrong, we might even go further backwards.
Was he right, though, centrally about his ideology, about what working class Labour voting seats needed? Was he right to say he should have pride in his economic strategy?
Well, we clearly weren't right, not just because of what happened last night, but this has actually been a long time coming. The long-term trend of working class communities and people moving away from Labour, the warning signs have been there for a long time. I know you had Lisa Nandy on earlier. In fact, Brexit itself was part of those warning signs, because many communities that are represented and have a long time been represented by the Labour Party locally and nationally, they disagreed with us about Brexit. They voted to leave and we wanted to remain. We didn't heed that warning then in 2016, and in 2017 many of the big swings away from us in that election that actually ended up being quite close were in those same communities. We didn't heed it then either. So we've got to really take a deep, long look at this. Let's not make any knee-jerk reactions and jump straight into a leadership election. Okay.
Lucy Powell, thank you very much indeed. Well, it has been a momentous few hours here at Westminster. We will have plenty more reaction throughout the day here on Election 2019. Now, the key moments.
I want to thank the people of this country for turning out to vote in a December election that we didn't want to call, but which I think has turned out to be a historic election.
I will not lead the party in any future general election campaign. I will discuss with our party to ensure there is a process now of reflection